Hey, so today we're going to be looking at the regional differences between the US and the Japanese version of 7 different Mario games. This footage was collected over the course of 2 years into a mega collection. So if you're interested in what drastic differences localizers have had to make something more appropriate for the US region for a primarily Japanese company, well then you're in the right place. So let's start with Super Mario Bros. 2. See, you know it, I know it. It's been memed to death. Super Mario Bros. 2 in the US was once known as Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. With how inescapably common that knowledge is, I had to sit here and wonder, is it even worth making a video about? But upon doing a personal investigation, I not only realized there's a lot of documented information that I knew nothing about, but personally going through these 2 games top to bottom, I realized there's a lot of undocumented things that separate Super Mario Bros. 2 from Doki Doki Panic. And so today I have collected every conceivable difference that I could possibly find and work it into a one-stop shop video to see everything that started with a collaborative effort between Fuji TV and Nintendo into an endearing classic that the Mario franchise recognizes to this very day. And so I found an insane amount of information this time around. Once again, per series tradition, we broke it off into categories. This time it's 6. We're going to start off with enemies. So the first enemy that I want to talk about is Phanto. Now this is one of the most stark differences between the 2 games. Obviously, the faces of the 2 are completely different, and I mean, it's arguable that maybe the original game is more creepy because it looks less sinister. But the differences for this enemy don't end there. In Doki Doki Panic, you were safe in the initial room that you picked up the key from. However, in Super Mario Bros. 2, the game explicitly shows a Phanto leaving the wall to harass you. And because of this fact, the developers of these 2 games decided to add additional Phantos in areas where there were none, or just added a level of symmetry to the room that you were in, thus showing more Phantos in each key room than most of the rooms between the 2 games. And then there's the Albatross. Now this one's really cool. Animators will get a really huge kick out of this one. In Doki Doki Panic, the number of frames of animation is only 2, and so as a result, the flapping looks a little bit quicker. But in Super Mario Bros. 2, the animation is more fluid with more frames of animation, and so as a result, the wings flap slower. And now this one's pretty insane. Just like the Zelda 2 episode that I did as the first episode of this series, I'll have a link to that in the description down below and at the end of the video, they added a boss that wasn't in the Japanese version. So in Doki Doki Panic, at level 5-3, you get another encounter with Mauser, this time with spikes on the ground, and the color that he sports is white with red accents. But in Super Mario Bros. 2 and onward, an incredibly unique boss named Claw Grip throws boulders at you, which you need to grab before it falls into the pit and throw it back at him. This version of Mauser is the final encounter with him in the game, and he takes 6 hits instead of the 3 when you first encounter him. Also, while we're still on the subject of Mauser, one small difference between him in Mario 2 and Doki Doki Panic is that when he gets damaged in Mario 2, he does a little animation of his damage sprite moving left and right, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, he just stays in place. And next up, let's talk about enemy placements that are different between the 2 versions. In level 4-3, when you're on the outside of the castle, there's a Bizo that flies above the protagonist's head immediately as you exit the door in Doki Doki Panic. But in Mario 2, that's not the case. Also on the opposite side, when you get into the other castle, there's another Bizo that's the same height going into the right direction in Doki Doki Panic, but not in Mario 2. And the answer for why this was removed might become a lot more apparent when you hop on the Bizo that's in the center of this area that spawns in both games. Because successfully riding the Bizo to whichever direction it's going doesn't really benefit the player in any way. All it does is bring you back to this little hill that you were supposed to go to with Birdo's eggs. And if you kept going further than that, you just end up back at the Birdo, which is the start of the level. And so although it's a difficult trick to pull off, successfully riding the Bizo, it doesn't really yield any benefits. So I can see why the developers removed those 2 from Mario 2, since it's a little more enticing for the player to hop on one. And then funny enough, in the same exact stage, you go inside one of the castles, and Doki Doki Panic has a tweeter that was removed from Super Mario Bros. 2, which, speaking of which, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'll leave a link to that in the video description as well as on the screen here right now. That plug was just too good to pass up. But why did they remove this tweeter? You could argue that it makes this portion of the game a little bit harder, but I think the true reason is that you'll most likely end up on the tweeter instead of the Shy Guy, and when you get all the way to the bottom, there's this little glitch that when it hops up on these ice blocks, it ends up hurting you even though you're on top of the tweeter. It doesn't really make any sense, and it's a pretty consistent glitch. So that would be my guess as to why it got removed. And then these ninjas actually behave differently between the 2 versions. In Doki Doki Panic, his jump height can be a little bit sporadic, whereas in Mario 2, he consistently jumps at the same height, which is the highest height. And then as for Wart here, there's one key difference in difficulty between the two versions. In Doki Doki Panic, Wart can be killed with 4 hits. And for some reason in Mario 2, they decided to ramp up the difficulty a little bit and make it 6 hits instead. Which I gotta say is a particularly cruel change for someone that had a really hard time figuring out Wart for the first time. And then the last enemy change we'll look at is technically also a field change, but you know what? There's more to the sprite when you're fighting it than when you're using it. So we're going to talk about Birdface here. Yume Kojo is based off of a real festival that involved Italian masks during that year. And so that's why so many enemies in this game, as well as so many items and stuff that we'll look at later, involve masks. And so to strip away some of that identity from Mario 2, the mask doors were changed to bird doors. And you can see what their entire sprites look like and the differences between the two when you face off against them in the last level. All right, that's it for enemy differences. Now, let's do one of my favorite subjects, the boxes. So right here in particular, I have to thank the translator of this episode, Sky. Make sure at some point you guys check out her new video that's on her channel. She does video game translation stuff too, and thank you so much. But anyways, let's start off by looking at the Super Mario 2 box. Start with the tagline is Mario Madness on the front, and then on the back it says Mario's back, bigger and badder than ever before. This time it's a fierce action-packed battle to free the land of Subcon from the curse of the evil Wart. It's up to you, along with Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Princess, to fight your way through bizarre multi-level worlds and find him. This time you got a brand new kind of power. Plucking power. And now anything you can find can be a weapon, but beware. You've never seen creatures like these. Shy Guys and Tweeters, Ninja and Bezos. You've never had an adventure like this. Only cunning and speed can save you now. And you'll see here that the cartridge and the manual all matches the front cover. Opening up here, we have a story synopsis with a picture of Mario walking up a staircase to a door. It says, one evening, Mario had a strange dream. He dreamt of a long, long stairway leading up to a door. As soon as the door opened, he was confronted with a world he had never seen before, spreading out as far as his eyes could see. When he strained his ears to listen, he heard a faint voice saying, welcome to Subcon, the land of dreams. We've all been cursed by Wart, and we're completely under his evil spell. We've been waiting for your arrival. Please defeat Wart and return Subcon to its natural state. The curse that Wart has put on you in the real world will not have any effect upon you here. Remember, Wart hates vegetables. Please help us. At the same time this was heard, a bolt of lightning flashed before Mario's eyes. Stunned, Mario lost his footing and tumbled upside down. He awoke with a start to find himself sitting up in his bed. To clear his head, Mario talked to Luigi, Toad, and Princess about the strange dream he had. They decided to go to a nearby mountain for a picnic. After arriving at the picnic area and looking out at the scenery, they see a small cave nearby. When they enter this cave, to their great surprise, there is a stairway leading up, up, and up. It is exactly the one that Mario saw in his dream. They all walk up to the stairs at the top, find a door that looks just like the one in Mario's dream, when Mario and his friends, in fear, open the door. To their surprise, the world he saw in his dream spreads out before them. Now, I read that all out to you because the story synopsis in Doki Doki Panic is much different than what we just read here. So that was definitely worth taking the time to read. And also remember that all this artwork that depicts Mario and friends running or plucking vegetables and whatnot, this is all uniquely made artwork for the US. This version of the game did not initially come out in Japan until afterwards, where it was known as Mario USA. And since we're on the subject of that really quick, there's only a couple of pieces of unique artwork that was not used in the US manual, and it's these characters right here. Anyways, getting back into it, showing you all the uniquely Mario designed artwork. You can see he's sporting his red overalls here. All right, now that we're on the page with the enemies, there is a ton of differences between the enemies described in Super Mario Bros. 2 and Doki Doki Panic. So here's a couple of things to note here while we're still on the US manual. These characters are called Shy Guys, and the red Shy Guy is described as a member of the 8 Bits, a club from evil dreams. He wears a mask because he's shy. The name of this enemy is the Sniffit, and once again references the 8 Bits Club. He wears a mask and spits the bullets of evil dreams from his mouth. And then there's the Ninja, and it says he is a little devil who appears in the dreams of NES players. He moves fast and will persistently chase you. Noticing that there's a lot of references to video games within these characters themselves. Also take note of the fact that on this page there's a tweeter, and it's described as, it's a bird with a mask. He hops. Try to get on top of his head. And also the Ninja 2 is described as a strange guy. Also, the Hoopster is described as the size of a basketball, and that the Phanto not only uses the original artwork from Doki Doki Panic, but also uses the in-game screenshot from Doki Doki Panic as well. There's a little bit of a mistake there. And take note of the Flurry. The description says, snow monster, he'll chase you on ice skates. For Trouter, it says that he lives in the world of dreams. Keep note of that. And also that this is what's considered to be a Birdo, which is wild. We'll flip the page in a second to show you what they consider Birdo to be. be. And for the Cobrat, take note of the fact that it says that it often appears in the dreams of Toad. Alright. Also take note of Pokey's face. Artwork looks a little bit good there, doesn't it? You'll find that to be pretty interesting in a little bit. And also the Autobomb, really quick, it says that a Shy Guy's favorite ride, it is also referred to as a bad dream machine. And that'll also be something that's different from Doki Doki Panic. But also there's a beta element here, both in the artwork and the game sprite. If you look at the game sprite for both versions of this game, the Shy Guys have a white M, and the M is taller too, which means it's more defined as the letter M than it was on the game manual, where it looked like it was lowercase, or not even meant to be an M to begin with. But I think now in the final game, the M was supposed to stand for Mamu, which I'll explain who Mamu is in a second. And also the Spark, alongside the Flurry and the Tweeter, are all enemies that will not show up in the Doki Doki Panic manual. And now let's show you what Birdo is called in this manual, which before Retcon was known as Ostro. The description reads, he thinks he is a girl and he spits eggs from his mouth, which has a very interesting discrepancy from the Doki Doki Panic description. We'll get to that in a second. Also for you younger kids, this is Mauser over here. Once again, Claw Grip is a unique enemy to Super Mario Bros. 2, so you're not going to see that in the manual for Doki Doki Panic, of course. Alright, so all the other enemies you're going to find out have very similar descriptions to Doki Doki Panic, which is why I didn't go through every single enemy. This is just to try to save on some time for what is already a massive video. If you'd like to read them, of course, you can always just pause the video at points just to compare the descriptions to how Sky translated it versus the localized translations in the manual. All right, now with all of that said, let's move on to Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. This game came with a little protective case. Previous owner placed the sticker of Mario holding hands with Imagine onto this plastic case. The original price of this game was 2,980 yen. Opening it up, we have a game manual and the Famicom disc. I'm gonna open up the Famicom disc for you first so you can see the sleeves that are used here. This game was originally for the Famicom Disk System, an add-on for the Famicom. And now let's look at the game manual. The game manual comes with stickers that you can put on your Famicom disc, including another sticker of Mario and Imagine. Here's Imagine on a carpet. And then here is a story synopsis. Sky did something really cool, and I didn't even ask her to do it. She actually translated the pages onto a PDF image that I found online. And so now I can read out this entire page, and you can read it out with me in English instead of looking at Japanese characters. Let's do it. It shows you the category of story. And then the title up top says, The Strange Story of the Dream Factory. And the header says, The Incident at the Dream World Mukai. So now every time you see the word Mukai in this manual, you can now understand why the US manual just refers to it as Dream World instead. Anyways, continuing on, this is the story of an unknown faraway place. There was once a dream world known as Mu, which had many happy people. In this strange kingdom, the weather changed depending on the dreams of the people who lived there. Pleasant days happened for pleasant dreams, and tempestuous weather for unpleasant dreams. But you couldn't know what the dream would be that day. That's why the dream machine was invented. They started making only good dreams. But one day, a strange monster, Mamu, aka War in the US, leapt out from this machine. It was bad. Instead of a dream, strange monsters started coming out and caused quite the scene. Mamu was pleased to see everyone so frantic. The people, in order to scare him off, brought things that he disliked to the dream machine, vegetables. Crushed by all the many vegetables, he surrendered. Hooray, hooray. And then moving on to the next page here, we got these image of two children and a monkey. That translates to picture book on the left and Dream Factory on the right. Anyways, let's read the translation here. The header says, Picky and Pocky have been grabbed by a giant hand. That is to say, this is the story of the picture book brought by Rusa, the monkey. The twins, Picky and Pocky, were reading it, completely absorbed by it. But then they started fighting over it and ripped out the page where Mamu was defeated. At that moment, a huge flash appeared and a giant hand popped out, grabbing the two of them, sucking them into the world of the book. Imagine ran out to the scene after hearing the screams and saw the figure of Mamu carrying Picky and Pocky away into the book. Imagine reached out his hand in a panic, and Papa and the others, who were watching in amazement, were all sucked into the picture book at the same time. Your goal is the Dream Factory, to find Mamu. With everyone's strength, go save Picky and Pocky. Which I'm sorry to my audience, but I gotta reiterate, thank you so much, Sky, for doing all this. It's incredible stuff. And I figure I'd take an opportunity to say that just because we're flipping through and showing you some of the unique Yume Kojo artwork here. As you can see, instead of Mario and Friends, it's the characters from Doki Doki Panic, running and picking up turnips. I'll also take an opportunity to say, since it doesn't really seem to explain in the manual, that the young boy in the turban is Imagine. The younger girl is his girlfriend, whose name is Lena. The older woman was just known as Mama. And the man with the mustache was known as Papa. Anyways, we're back to the pages with the enemies, and let's translate it. Keep in mind, most of these names I'm going to be describing to you are still the official Japanese names to this day. Shy Guys are known as Hey-Hos, which that explains why you hear this a lot in modern games. And they are described as a type of Mamu, not part of some gang, like it was in the Super Mario 2 manual. Sniffits were known as Muchos, and you may notice there's also a gray Shy Guy here, and it's described as they move slowly but have crafty ways of attacking the player. Well, guess what? That's a character that doesn't exist in either Super Mario Bros. 2 or Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. So Nintendo erroneously put a cut character in their game manual, which is why you don't see it in the Super Mario Bros. 2 one. Anyways, the ninjas are known as Hakuns. Instead of the NES, like I mentioned earlier, it says it invades the dreams of young boys who play the Famicom. The B version has a much more plain description. Fanto is known as Mosk. Hoopster is known as Toppin. Bezos are known as Tondarias. Bob Oms were just known as Bob, which looks like, according to Sky here, that was later changed. Up here, it says the Harimanen, which is translated to definitely needles. Pidgeots are known as Dodori Getsu. Instead of Birdo, we got Doucho. And instead of Ostro, we have Catherine. Now the description for Catherine is, thinks it is female, shoots eggs from the mouth, likes to be called Kissy. Mauser's name is one of my favorite differences. Apparently in Japan he's known as Don Chulj. I love that a lot. And also we got the Pokey here, known as Sanpo, which translates to walking. And the face is completely different from how it looks in the final game, which is probably why it's one of the few pieces of artwork that got updated for Super Mario Bros. 2. Then there's the Turbon here, and it says that it's also called the Terrifying Stroller. And the translation note says the stroller should be referred to basically as like a baby carriage. Over on the next page, the Fry Guy is known as Hibobo. And if anyone's ever told you that the Pokey is the only thing that changed artwork-wise, they, in a very small technicality, would be wrong, as there's a teeny tiny piece of flame in the Doki Doki Panic depiction of Fry Guy. If we cut back to the manual for Super Mario Bros. 2, that one little piece of fire happens to be missing. Yeah, we get that thorough around here. Anyways, Wart, like I said, is known as Mamu, which is also the name used in Link's Awakening. So that's pretty cool. And then over on the right here, I had to tell you about this translation because it's kind of funny to me. It translates as telephone card present. Thank you so much for purchasing Doki Doki Panic. At Fuji TV, we celebrate our release by giving a limited time telephone card, not for resale, to 2,000 customers. Carefully read the form below before filling it out to apply. How to apply? Take the seal found at the start of this booklet, place it on a postcard, including your name, address, and phone number, and then mail it. First lottery closes on July 31st, and the last on September 9th. Winners will receive a notice in the mail. With Imagine saying, first round is 1,500 people, and the last is 500. Just thought that was interesting. Yeah, again, if you didn't know, Fuji TV, which is a television channel for Japan, hosted this festival. So these are characters owned by Fuji TV. That's why they're giving you a telephone card, I guess. And then here's some hilarious artwork about how to take care of your Famicom disc properly. You guys missed it, but the second I saw the foot about to step on the Famicom disc, I truly did laugh out loud. And then on the back is an image of the entire family. Okay, now we're going to be talking about field changes. These are changes that are not directly involved with enemies or music. These are all things that are just in the levels, like items or levels themselves. And my god, there are a lot of them. So let's get started. All right, so here we go. For the Mario 2 version, we have a moving beanstalk, moving cherries, moving POW block, and red moving turnips. Over in Doki Doki Panic, the cherry does not move, the POW block does not move, the beanstalk doesn't move, and the turnips don't move either, and instead the color is black. In Super Mario Bros. 2, you might remember that the potion is what spawns a door to go to the bonus area. However, in Doki Doki Panic, it is a magic lamp. And if we go inside, we can see that in Super Mario Bros. 2, it's a mushroom that increases your health, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, it is a heart with eyes. Now, I gave a seizure warning at the start of this episode, but this in particular may be really hard on some people, so consider skipping it if you need to. The water in Doki Doki Panic moves a lot faster than it does in Super Mario Bros. 2. But not only that, you can see that the top of the waterfall looks different, and that there are drops of water splashing around at the top. In the US version, like I said, it's slower, but also those water droplets do exist, they're just less frequent, and and they're not multicolored like they were in the other game. Also, in indoor levels, the spikes are animated in Super Mario Bros. 2 and have a sort of corkscrew effect, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, the spikes are completely different and have a more horizontalness to lines on the sides of them that don't even wrap all the way around. And then in later levels, you can see the ocean, and once again, the developers took the time to animate the ocean water in Super Mario Bros. 2, whereas it's stagnant and once again completely unanimated in Doki Doki Panic. This change is a lot more subtle, so keep a close eye out, but all the quicksand animates differently, and this slower quicksand here sort of drops down in a way that kind of looks like snowflakes in Super Mario Bros. 2, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, it almost looks like it's printing something off of computer paper. And for the quicksand that moves faster, you can see that it's also animated a little bit differently. And then for the clouds, all the clouds in Super Mario Bros. 2 animates as well, having a bit of a pulsating effect, whereas once again in Doki Doki Panic, it doesn't animate. Over in the last stage, there's a conveyor belt here, and not only do they animate differently, but they're different colors entirely. The center of the conveyor belt in Super Mario Bros. 2 has diagonal lines that are completely white, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, it's white with red edges. And the edges of the conveyor belt in Super Mario Bros. 2 match each other, whereas in Doki Doki Panic, it sports a red line on top and a white line on the bottom. The crystal ball that you get from Birdo is animated in Super Mario Bros. 2, sporting a shimmer or a shine, and for a single frame, it matches exactly how it looks in Doki Doki Panic, which has no shine whatsoever. The explosion effect for bombs are completely different between the two versions. It's awesome. If I had to guess what's going on here, Doki Doki Panic says B-O-M, bomb, and it's very likely that it's an onomatopoeia, which is used very frequently in Japanese media, whereas Super Mario Bros. 2 just wrote out the entire word bomb with the B. And once again, because this game was a tie-in for a festival that was thematic with Italian masks, all the mushrooms that were in Super Mario Bros. 2 were originally masks that function exactly the same in Doki Doki Panic. And one thing you may not have realized if you were a casual fan of Super Mario Bros. 2 is that the throwable mushrooms have different designs as you go through the game. There isn't just one singular design. And the same thing can be said for Doki Doki Panic. In fact, it's even more obvious in Doki Doki Panic because the faces are distinctly different. But I suppose is what they do with that palette is drastically different between each mask. In level 5-3, there is a secret warp right at the top of this ladder, and you'll notice that 2 tiles from the dirt is removed in Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, my first initial impression for this change was that it looked more organic to not have the dirt just suddenly end on a little small cliff like that. But also, it serves as a functionality, which may be the true reason, which is that in Doki Doki Panic, if you angle your jumps just right, you could get up there with some characters without having to do anything too complicated, which may not have been the original design by the developers. This next one will definitely be controversial for Doki Doki Panic. In Super Mario Bros. 2, you might remember there's a Koopa shell that can glide across the stage and hit multiple enemies. Well, in Doki Doki Panic, the item is known as a big face, and based off of the sound effect used for when it hits a wall, it seems to be a living entity. Descriptions of the big face in the game's manual only describe its functionality. In one of the last levels, 7-1, this little area here where you have to run through a gambit basically has been slightly altered in Super Mario Bros. 2, removing a couple of platforms. And when you go up the ladder, oddly enough, the ladder is placed in a different spot at the bottom of the map. As you can see, it's moved a little closer to the left in the Super Mario Bros. 2 version. And in level 6-3, there's a hidden area. And as you can see, the layout to get to the pyramid is completely different between the two games. The pyramid is just moved closer to the door in Doki Doki Panic. And for some reason, the developers wanted to make you work for it a little bit in Super Mario Bros. 2 by adding in cloud platforms. I think the reason for this change is that if you go through the stage normally, you'll see that door off to the right in Doki Doki Panic, which is just meant to be a shortcut. It's not meant to entice the player to figure out how to get up there. It's simply supposed to be an exit door for people that find the initial secret. And so by adding the cloud platforms in Super Mario Bros. 2, it hides the door away with the purpose of not confusing the player. In the very last level, we get to Wart's Castle, and there's a very unusual change here. In Doki Doki Panic, the windows used to be smaller, and the entrance to the castle looked more like it had some depth by slicing the door frame in half, which honestly makes more sense than how they changed it for Super Mario Bros. 2, where now the door frame is on the side facing the player. But if it was my task to figure out the logic behind why the developers would make make this change. I suppose the one that would make the most sense is that the character walks into the door frame and then stops, which doesn't make as much sense as pressing the up button to walk into a door frame. And so if the door frame is facing the player, it maybe feels more organic to press up to go into the door like all the other doors in the game, as opposed to walking into the side of a door frame. This is a pretty unusual change here. The layout of the stars between the two games are different from one another. Both games have stars in the sky, but for some reason they're just mapped out differently between the two versions. And what's also funny is that they're the same star pattern, it's just that Doki Doki Panic gets its star pattern started earlier in the level than it does in Super Mario Bros. 2. And then in Wart's room, for some reason the tiles that were used are different between the two versions. The reason for this is by no means obvious, and if I had to take any sort of guess as to why they would make this change, it looks like the original intent behind the tiles in Doki Doki Panic were to give the tiles a bit of a rounded look, but it wasn't properly achieved because the black outline makes a square instead, and rather than fight against that, they embraced it for Super Mario Bros. 2 by changing the design completely to be more boxy and square. Though funny enough, it has a more robotic design in Super Mario Bros. 2, which lends itself a little bit better to the idea that it's attached to the Dream Machine, which is the thing that's spitting out the vegetables. Oh, and speaking of the vegetables, this one I have absolutely no idea why this is the case. They changed one of the vegetables from Doki Doki Panic to something else in Super Mario Bros. 2. Both vegetables have a mean looking design, just one is a little bit thinner looking than the other. I can't confirm this myself, but maybe the hitbox on the two vegetables are different from one another, seeing as one of them is thinner than the other. And this one may have been a programming error that got fixed in Super Mario Bros. 2. In level 4-1, there's a difficult to reach magic lamp that can take you to the bonus area. However, in Doki Doki Panic, there's no point to grabbing this, because outside of a couple of coins you can grab, there's no mushroom on the other side. And only a few steps further, you'll get another magic lamp that will give you a mushroom by the rocket. In Super Mario Bros. 2, they just give you 2 mushrooms. You can get one in this area where it's difficult to get the magic potion, and then you can get another mushroom by the rocket, same as Doki Doki Panic. Okay, now we can move on to music and sound design. Seeing as one version's on a Famicom disc and the other's on a cartridge, you're gonna find that a lot of the sounds come off a little bit differently, especially the sound effects. But there's a lot of music that's completely different too. To start with, the subspace theme is completely different between the two versions. Here's the theme in Super Mario Bros. 2. As you can see, it's a remix of the Super Mario Bros. 1 theme, and here's how the theme goes in Doki Doki Panic, which has more of an Arabian feel to it. Same can be said for when you pick up a star. Here's the traditional Starman theme from Super Mario Bros. 2. And here's the uniquely composed theme for Doki Doki Panic. Also, for the common theme in Super Mario Bros. 2, there's a whole nother verse that's added to the game that's not included in Doki Doki Panic. I'll take you guys over to the part where it transitions to this part that was not included in Doki Doki Panic. And now you can hear how it loops in Doki Doki Panic instead. Making it a little more repetitive. And that same thing happens in the character select screen. There's a whole extra part that's added for Super Mario Bros. 2. Queuing it in right now. And you'll see the loop here in Doki Doki Panic where this extra bit hasn't even been conceived yet. And then the cave theme is kind of interesting. They both sound somewhat similar, except the Doki Doki Panic version is faster in tempo and also lacks a percussion. So here's how that sounds real quick. Now here's how that theme sounds in Super Mario Bros. 2. Once again, keep an ear open for the slower tempo and the bongo drums in the background. Yeah, so let's go over a couple of the sound effects now. First, we got the rocket here. This is what the rocket sounds like in Super Mario Bros. 2. And now, here's how the rocket sounds in Doki Doki Panic. As a little bonus there, you got to hear the differences in the bomb sound effect as well, as the exploding rocket shares the same sound effect as the bombs. Here's the sound effect for dropping the lamp versus dropping the magic potion. You're going to notice that the magic lamp sounds more like a bell, whereas Super Mario Bros. 2 sounds like a deep bell or a bass guitar. And then defeating an enemy in Doki Doki Panic makes the enemy give out a cry of some sort, which when you listen to the sound effect may be a huge inspiration for why the Shy Guy sounds the way it does today. Whereas in Super Mario Bros. 2, it has more of an impact noise than anything that would resemble an enemy crying out in some sort of way. Doki Doki Panic has an exclusive noise for when the protagonist loses a life. Here, give it a listen. And as you're going to see here in Super Mario Bros. 2, there's no sound effect at all. As for opening the door, the two sound effects are very distinctly different from one another, though the idea is still the same. You can decide for yourself which one sounds better. Okay, next up is heroes, aka the main protagonists of the game. So obviously, to start with, we have Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Peach, and the counterparts for each character is Imagine, Mama, Papa, and Lena. And let's get into all the differences between the two. So first of all, when you play Super Mario Bros. 2, every single character shares a 1-up mushroom, and it has a unique sound effect for when you get the 1-up mushroom, which plays out like this. But in Doki Doki Panic, each character has a face that represents the 1-up, and it reuses the jingle for when you get the pearl from Birdo. In Doki Doki Panic, the taller characters can't collect the cherries with their heads. As you're going to see by this side-by-side comparison, Luigi, the tallest character in the game, merely has to walk past a cherry that reaches his head in order to collect it, whereas Mama in this example here will have to use the lower part of her body to collect that cherry. And speaking of Mama and Luigi, out of all the characters, Luigi has the most stark difference between his original counterpart. For some reason, Luigi can jump slightly higher than Mama, which allows him to take better advantage of the environment in the game, whereas Mama's just kind of locked into a weird pattern and doesn't really get a chance to take advantage of the environment in the same way Luigi does. Also, this one's a huge detriment to Doki Doki Panic. The characters in Super Mario Bros. 2 can run, whereas the characters in Doki Doki Panic cannot. This creates all sorts of problems for when you're playing Doki Doki Panic as a Super Mario Bros. 2 fan. One of the biggest being Peach's float has a lot more advantages due to the amount of distance that she can cover versus Lena, who once again can't take much advantage of the environment due to the fact that she can't get a running start. Also, the characters in Super Mario Bros. 2 shrink down when reduced to a single piece of health, just as a nod to the Mario franchise. And seeing as this wasn't originally a Mario Brothers game, the Yume Kojo characters stay the same size on their last piece of health. This is also a really subtle one. I couldn't believe that it was never mentioned on the cutting room floor. In fact, there's a couple things that were mentioned here that haven't been updated on the website. Maybe someone can do that on my behalf. But one huge difference between Super Mario Bros. 2 and Doki Doki Panic is that you can't combo enemy throws in Doki Doki Panic. You can throw one enemy into another, but if they happen to make contact with a third enemy, that third enemy will not die, which in Mario Bros. 2, you can keep that combo going for as long as you can. Now let's talk about the last subject, miscellaneous. This is like a lot of weird things that just couldn't be categorized, so let's get into it. First of all, the progression between Doki Doki Panic and Super Mario Bros. 2 is completely different. In Super Mario Bros. 2, you might remember you only have to get through the game once. However, in Doki Doki Panic, you can see this screen here. And it's basically your checklist for beating every single world with every single character. And every time you beat a world, your box gets filled in with the color green. Now that's kind of cool, except you can't get the true ending unless you beat the game with every character and every world. And on top of that, you can't switch characters in between levels. And even if you do switch characters between worlds, which is something that you are allowed to do, you can't go on to the next world with the next character. You simply have to start from whatever world your character is progressing with if you choose to pick that character. So if you're on level 6, for example, with Papa, and you want to switch over to Imagine, you will have to start at level 1, assuming you haven't used Imagine yet. Now this frustration is mitigated a bit over the fact that Doki Doki Panic had a save system. So although it would take a lot longer to get the true ending of Doki Doki Panic, you at least didn't have to deal with limited continues, and you could slowly chip away at the game over time, which is something I did not do for this video, so you can imagine how melted my brain felt after doing all this to get the footage needed. So then what happens if you beat the game with only one character? Well, just like in Super Mario Bros. 2, your character will go into this special room and yank the cork out of this pipe to release these little guys that are featured in both games. Now in Doki Doki Panic, you only see this screen if you haven't officially beaten the game yet. They thank you for freeing them, and then you have to get booted back to the title screen to continue your progress with the other characters. And speaking of the title screen, here's the entirety of the Super Mario Bros. 2 screen, where it goes over a story synopsis and has a special border with frozen images of the Mario cast. However, Doki Doki Panic has a completely different title screen involving a sky and fireworks, and then it has a visual representation of the intro of the game with Picky and Pocky looking for the book, getting captured by Wart, and then the main cast getting sucked into the book as well. From there, you have to flip the Famicom disc and then pick your character for your adventure. You may have remembered from the story synopsis in the boxes section, but this whole story in Doki Doki Panic takes place in a book instead of inside of Mario's dream. And so when you pause the game, as well as pick the level from the character select screen, there is a motif involving pages from a book. In fact, when you pause the game in Doki Doki Panic, it tells you what quote-unquote page you're on, which in truth is telling you what level you're on, being that there are 20 levels in total. Each page represents one level. So it's kind of funny that Super Mario Bros. 2 ripped that motif and repurposed it into a pause screen that just looks like a border or a shape. Also, the bonus chance screen is completely different between the two games. Doki Doki Panic has this really plain green looking roulette screen, whereas Super Mario Bros. 2 has this much nicer looking slot machine screen. And at the start of the game, Super Mario Bros. Uses stars instead of the small turnips that are used in Doki Doki Panic. Doki Doki Panic doesn't end there. Depending on what world you're in, they will change the vegetables to match the vegetables that's used in that particular world. Something that does not happen in Super Mario Bros. 2. And finally, let's talk about the true ending between both versions. Although Wart's carried away by an identical sprite and the identical characters on the bottom, everything else is different. Super Mario Bros. 2 tells you who the top contributor is and does a tally for how many levels were completed with each character. Also features podiums and a giant platform and windows, as opposed to Doki Doki Panic, which just has a giant cage. But the key difference here is that after Wart gets beat up, key is flown from outside the screen, into the keyhole, unlocking the prison for Picky and Pocky. Then things just become completely different. In Doki Doki Panic, it's daytime instead of nighttime, and the kids, as well as the family, are released from the book. Whereas in Super Mario Bros. 2, it is revealed that Mario is dreaming the whole time in a beautifully animated ending sequence. The two theme songs for the endings are completely different, and I've been playing them in the background for you. I'm going to switch over now to Doki Doki Panic's ending theme, since it's more likely you may have heard the Super Mario Bros. 2 ending theme, and you can keep an ear open for it. I'm going to bump it up just slightly more than I usually do so that you can definitely hear the song. And in Doki Doki Panic, you get the credits from the developers with the game's world being shown like a window in the back of the book. And on Super Mario Bros. 2, the developers go completely uncredited, and instead, the game takes the time to give you silhouettes of all the creatures in the game, right down to the bosses, and then has Wart with an unassuming look on his face, then he laughs and fades away. Mario 2's ending says, "The end," and Doki Doki Panic's ending is going to say exactly what I will say to all of you watching at home. Thanks a million. Alright, with 2 out of the way, let's move on to Super Mario Bros. 3, and just jumping into categories here, let's take a look at difficulty. So what you're going to see here is that the US version is significantly easier than the Japanese one. But after we go over all the differences, I think you're going to understand that most of these changes were made for the better. But to start with, here's one drastic change that you'll see here. In World 1's Fortress, you'll see that the room with the dropping spikes has its recessed spikes 2 tiles away from the dead end in the Japanese version, and the door is also 1 tile away from that as well. That means by the original design, you weren't meant to just run all the way as fast as you can and then hit that door and then try to get through that door as quickly as possible. Sure, you could still do that, but it's not quite as mindless as it is in the US version, where the door and the recessed spikes are at the very end, making it incredibly likely that if you just hit the wall, you'll be fine. But here's probably the most significant change between the two versions. Super Mario Bros. 3 in Japan has the Super Mario Bros. 1 rules, where no matter how many power-ups you stack, one hit sets you all the way back to your Tiny Mario state. Obviously, in the US version, this was frankly what I consider to be changed for the better, where if you get hit with your power-up, you're then regressed to Big Mario, and then you can regress to Tiny Mario, allowing you to take at least one more extra hit. This includes the rare suits and the Karibo shoe. Yeah, so technically you could stack 3 power-ups and lose it all with one hit. And with how unusual it is to run around in the Karibo shoe, I would definitely say this change to the US version is a huge, huge mercy rule. And then speaking of mercy rules, at the end of the water ship level in the last world, the developers added a single chip on the side of the ship. And this is just so that you can get back on the ship a lot easier. Yeah, technically you can get back on that ship in the Japanese version. It's just really, really hard. In fact, I wanted to demonstrate that you could get back up there for the sake of this video, but I was only able to do it one time and I wasn't recording the footage at the time, but you'll just have to take my word for it. If nothing else, I can at least example right here just how hard it actually is to get back on that ship. But that's not to say that everything is made easier in the US version. There is one weird change that makes it a little bit harder for US players. And that is that the first Mushroom Hut in World 6 gives you a guarantee of the most glorious power-up in the entire series, the Hammer Brothers suit, whereas in the US version, for some reason, they changed it out for regular power-ups. And now we're going to talk about my favorite segment on this series, and that is the boxes. There always seems to be something to say when we look at the two different types of boxes between two different regions, and Super Mario Bros. 3 is no exception. And so the first one I want to talk about is the US box, and we'll get through this one pretty quickly. Nintendo of America chose to add some simplicity to this release, and I gotta say, it probably worked out really well for them, because I remember the iconic yellow box as a small child. Take note on how the 3 looks on this box, because we'll be talking about that later, and it features its own tagline on the box, saying, "The biggest, most exciting Mario Brothers adventure yet." Now, I could read out the entire back of the box here, but you're welcome to pause the YouTube video to read it yourself, because there's a lot that we still have to go over here that has a lot of dialogue. Opening up the contents of the box, you'll see that it comes with a cartridge with a yellow label, and comes with a colorized manual, all in English. Now these manuals have a lot of personality to them, which includes a message from Mario that says, "Hello, how have you been? It's been a long time since we've seen each other. Bowser is up to his old tricks again, so Luigi and I are going back on another adventure. You're welcome to come along. This time it's Super Mario Bros. 3, the latest in the Super Mario Bros. Series. You'll experience lots of excitement as your journey unfolds. For beginners and seasoned veterans of our previous games, this one is going to be a lot of fun. Let's look at Super Mario Bros. 3 in a bit more detail, with Bowser underneath saying, 'Ha ha ha, these are my 7 children that are going to help me take over the Mushroom World.' And then on the right side of the page, it says, 'These are Bowser's kids,' and they, in unity, say, 'We just love being mean.'" Now, throughout the manual, you'll find that it explains the story, and then each Koopaling has a little phrase that it's going to say to Mario. Larry says, "We took 7 wands from 7 kings. Each of us has one. Our father has instructed us to protect the wands." So as you can already tell, the manual really hammers in that these are Bowser's kids. Morton Koopa Jr. says, "Grr, you're pretty tricky with all these new moves. Mario will be difficult to beat. I better report this to our dad." Also, for when we take a look at the Japanese version, keep it in the back of your mind how the art looks on these 2 pages. You'll notice that the colors are completely solid and the lines are completely clean. But then on the next page, you're going to see that there's some watercolor art. Anyways, Wendy Koopa says, "This is the first time I've met up with Mario. I'm studying his moves very carefully." Iggy says, "Haha, Mario and his friends must be getting very nervous now. I can hardly wait to meet up with him." Roy says, "Wow, Mario has some neat new tricks. I hope we can stop him." And then we got Lemmy here that says, "How far can Mario go? I hope he doesn't make it this far. Dad has many complicated tricks waiting for him in the Dark Land. I even heard about some new weapon that Dad's been making." One interesting thing to know here is that boos were once called Boo Diddley, and also that the concept art for the dry bones were later reused for Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. I was always confused by that design, but now it all makes sense. Also, keep in the back of your mind the Sledge Brothers, as that name is going to be relevant to what we're going to be talking about with the Japanese version in a little bit. And we got Ludwig here saying, "Quite an exciting game, isn't it? I'm glad to know that we have such powerful enemies helping us out. We have more guys helping us besides these. Don't tell Mario." And then there's a special message from the Mario staff. Now, this is really interesting because look how short this dialogue is. I'll read it out to you. It says, "To Mario players, thanks for selecting Super Mario Bros. 3. We've been working hard to make this game even better than Super Mario Bros. 1 and 2. In addition to the action scenes, we've added a world map that you can plot your progress as well as play a new 2-player game. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you will find many more hidden things than in the first 2 games in the series. We think that you'll find it much more challenging as well. Have fun. Yours truly, Mario's staff." Now, this is also in the Japanese version, and when we get to it, you're going to see that this is really shortened down, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Anyways, you look at the back of the manual, and you'll just see a coffee stain here. Obviously, that's not coming with every release, but I just wanted to point out that there's no real artwork on the back. And now, let's talk about the Famicom version. To start with, you can see that the 3 here has a tanuki tail hidden as a shadow drop, and this imagery is used in the game itself in both the US and the Japanese release. So I guess it was a quirk that was a little more important to the Japanese developers. Anyways, you're going to see a 2-tone checker pattern used as a border with a much more busy image of Raccoon Mario cast against all the Koopalings, Bowser, Luigi, Princess Toad, a Lakitu, a Blooper, and Goombas all over, with Bowser looking especially weird. And you know what's so odd about this image is that you're going to see in a little bit that he doesn't look as unusual in the game manual itself. So it's not even future release promotional material. There is a contrast look to Bowser within the contents of the game box itself of the original release. Alright, let's talk about the back of the box. Now, I didn't read the back of the box for the US version, but basically, if you didn't choose to read the back, it's just all about the features of Super Mario Bros. 3. Whereas on the back here with the red box, it says, "Without further ado, meet the 3rd Super Mario Bros. Game. Heading to the Mushroom World from the Mushroom Kingdom, we fight Koopa's troops yet again. This time, the big King Koopa's children, all 7 of them, join the fight as well, each with their own strange abilities. Along the way, you'll meet 7 kings who've been transformed into animals. Mario and Luigi, in order to restore peace to the Mushroom World, have set out yet again on an adventure to rescue Princess Peach." Which, that's pretty cool. So there was a lot of lore here. Apparently, there's a distinction between the Mushroom Kingdom and Mushroom World. So we're going to be spending a bit of time here talking about what the original Japanese text was actually saying. If you notice that there's any Koopalings missing in this segment, it's just because it's so strikingly similar to the US version. I'm trying to save you guys on some time. Anyways, the letter from Mario is a bit different. Instead of hello, it says, "Yahoo! Have you all been well? I'm so happy to see you. It's been a long time. It seems that King Koopa, who should have been taken care of before, has started up his evil tricks again. Luigi and I are setting on our 3rd adventure, but you're coming too." And here's where things go off on a totally different tangent. And Mario starts promoting Super Mario Bros. 3 and even goes as far as talking about the megabits. Here we have it translated as, "Super Mario Bros. 3 is the latest addition to the Super Mario series and is a technical fantasy game that takes full advantage of the large capacity of 3 megabits. Experience the best action in a bizarre world. The game can be enjoyed by almost anyone, from beginners who are a little unsure of themselves to super players who have played the previous games. So let's take a closer look at the fun-filled Mario 3 and wah!" Wah. Alright. And here you can see an unused image of Bowser stomping on Mario, and it says "Dune," which is an onomatopoeia in Japan. It says, "Bowser's at it again," and Bowser starts saying, "Wah ha ha ha. I'm letting my kids explain how this works this time. Listen to them well if you want to think about winning. Wah ha 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 ha." And then the kids on the right say, "We love mischief." Now, this is similar but very, very different for Larry here. In the US version, it was strictly information. Here, he says, "Those dumb 7 kings had 1-1. We Koopa kids took 1 each. We don't want to get yelled at by Dad, so we're not going to give it back that easily." So you can see that it's a lot more aggressive and dysfunctional, if you will. Morton says, "So he's finally showed up. If Mario transforms, he's going to be hard to beat. I better tell Papa." And then in the US version, you might remember I told you to pay close attention to this page because everything had solid lines and full colors. But in the Japanese version, they were done with water paints. It was clearly traced over for the US release, which is, again, funny because they didn't do that for the entire manual of the US one. You can still see water paint from time to time. So I guess Roy Koopa speaks in a heavy accent called Kansai Ben. Bet there's something Mario would want. There are some items that can't be used on the map screen, so be very careful, which is a completely different set of dialogue from Roy Koopa in the US manual. And here you can see another completely unused image that was only in the Japanese version. And chances are this image was not used in the US manual because, once again, it uses watercolor art that the US version tried to distance itself from. And this is a lot more complicated than the stuff that they touched up prior. So chances are that's why it got removed. Anyways, it's all the Koopalings on one airship, as well as Princess Peach tied to the top, a transformed king, a Raccoon Mario, and Luigi running up castle steps. And then here on this page, you might remember that I told you to pay attention to the name of the Sledge Brothers in the US version. That's because in the Japanese version, they translate out to Fatty Brothers. And the description goes on further, whereas the US version doesn't mention their weight at all. The Japanese one says, hammer brothers who are fat. Their heavy bodies shake the ground, and they're hard to stop as they throw their hammers. When these guys land on the ground, you should jump to avoid being unable to move. And then Ludwig in the Japanese manual is more dismissive of the Super Mario Bros. 1 enemies. So he goes on to say, yay, are you with it? We got more extremely powerful pals this time. I'm stoked, baby. To be honest, we already had other pals, but they're no good against Mario. And of course, that note to the players was something I made sure to tell you guys. Keep in mind that it was really short for the US version. Now, with this Japanese one, you can see all sorts of neat stuff in English. It says like to Mario players, and then at the bottom it says yours faithfully, and it's dated October 23rd, 1988. And then it says Mario's staff in cursive handwriting. Already, without even translating this, you can see there's more care and attention to this note than what we got in the US manual. And you'll also notice that there's a PS. Something that was not in the US manual at all. So let's read it out to you. To Mario players, thank you so much for buying Super Mario Bros. 3. We've heard you Mario fans and have crafted a new, much more fun game from the previous title, and it's Super Mario Bros. 3. In addition this time to being an action game, we've added a map that makes it seem more like a board game, and we've added separate continues for each player, so you can play a bit longer with 2 players. And the continues now take you specifically to the last level you cleared, so if you put your powers together, you can beat the course. Additionally, there are lots of mysteries and challenges this time. What kind of mysteries do Mario and Luigi have? I hope you look forward to finding out. P.S. Unfortunately, this title lacks the battery back upgrade, so when you turn off the power, you will have to start over from the beginning. Hidden boxes throughout the courses may be of some help. So it seems that the US version was not happy in omitting a concession, whereas in the Japanese version, they did. And I also found it kind of interesting to discover that the developers see their overworld maps as like a board game. Never thought about it like that before, but I guess I could see that. And anyways, on the back, you can see Mario in a raccoon suit carrying a Koopa shell. Something that is not featured on the back of the US manual. So earlier we incorporated translation differences between the written material inside the boxes of the US and Japanese versions. Now let's talk about a few highlight differences in the translation of the actual game itself. Now I want to say a big thank you to Sky for translating all these for me. She has her own YouTube channel where she does translation content. You should definitely check it out. And to clarify here, the translations provided for the games are literal translations. And one of the things I found really interesting was all the Toad minigames. Here for the lineup minigame, for example, he says, line up the pictures and get a prize. You only get one try. In the US version, this personality trait gets completely lost, but if you look at the Japanese version, you can see that one word is used twice in a row. And so that translates to spin, spin, flip over a card, and get various things. You can only mess up once. Now that becomes thematic when you go over to the card flipping minigame. You can already see that the US version once again does not use that charming little trait, whereas the Japanese version doubles down on it. Picture matching, if you do well. How fun! You only get one big chance. And you see it yet again when you go to visit the castle for the first time. In the US version, Toad says, oh, it's terrible, the king has been transformed. Please find the magic wand so we can change him back. However, Toad in the Japanese version yet again does some repeating, starting off with, oh no, the king has been transformed into this. Take back the magic wand. And here you can see the king do the same thing. In the US version, it says, oh, thank heavens, I'm back to my old self again. Thank you so much, here's a letter from the princess. Whereas the Japanese king says, good, I've returned back to my original self. Thank you. A letter arrived from Princess Peach. And if we move over to the letter, you can see that the game is pretty apprehensive at this point of calling Princess Peach, Princess Peach. In the US version, you see that the word toadstool is used more often than anything else. While we're at it, let's do a comparison of one of the notes in between the two versions. In the US version, it always opens up with greetings, but in the Japanese version, you can see that it opens up with a question. And that's because in the Japanese version, she always opens up with, how are you? And with almost every single letter, you'll find that Princess Peach says, I have enclosed a jewel that helps protect you. Now, this may be what I consider to be the only mistranslation in this entire game. Most of the time, we would not call these inaccuracies mistranslations because localizing a game is a different beast entirely from just translating a game. However, this is one instance in which I don't believe the localizers for the US version quite understood what they were trying to get across in the original Japanese text. Princess Peach in the US version refers to things like the music box or a P-Wing as a jewel, which that doesn't make a lot of sense. However, a jewel can be a type of treasure, and a really helpful item in Super Mario Bros. Could also be considered treasure. And so the literal translation from the Japanese version is, "I've sent some treasure with the letter. Hope it is of help. Peach." And then you get a letter from Bowser at the end of World 7. In the US version, it says, "Yo, I kidnapped the princess while you were running around. She's here in my castle, if you dare to try to rescue her. Ha ha ha, King of the Koopa." Whereas in the Japanese version, it's pretty similar, but there are a little bit of differences here and there. Instead of yo, it's ha. And then it goes on to say, "While you were wandering around, the princess has been kidnapped by me. If you don't like it, then I dare you to try coming to my castle. Gwahahaha, Koopa." And as anybody knows, in Japan, he's known as Koopa instead of Bowser, which actually created a terrible mistranslation for the European version, where the end of the letter is written out as Koopa Troopa, which of course is not Koopa himself, but instead one of the minor villains in the game. And then this one is localized completely differently. For the US version, Princess Peach says, "Thank you, but our princess is in another castle." Just kidding. Ha ha ha. Bye bye. But in the Japanese version, Princess Peach says, "Thank you. Peace is finally restored to the mushroom world." And then there's the dashes, and then it says "the end." Which is kind of funny because then the credits roll, and regardless of which version you play, it'll still say "the end" on the curtains. So the game went for the trouble of saying "the end" twice. And although the words are both in English, the US version says Castle of Koopa, whereas the Japanese version says Castle of Kuppa, which I'm told was interchangeable back in the day. But now let's talk about some changes in this game. Let's just start talking about things that the developers decided to change just for the sake of presentation or legality. Sometimes I forget kids watch my content. You ready to talk about legality, kids? All right, let's do it. So first of all, you're going to see here that both the 3 in the US and the Japanese version has that shadow of a tanuki soup behind it. That's just a callback to earlier in this video. But that's not why we're looking at this. Some of you probably already know why we're talking about this screen. And in case you haven't seen it yet, Super Mario Bros. 3 is trademarked differently between the Japanese and the US version. See, in the Japanese version, Super Mario Bros. Is trademarked, but the 3 is not, which is something that needed to be fixed. So for the US version, they moved the trademark over to the side of the 3 so that it's Super Mario Bros. 3 that is trademarked, not just Super Mario Bros. And now let's talk about every single level you ever go to in Super Mario Bros. 3. Check this out. Did you see the difference there? So every time you boot a level in the Japanese version, the cookie cut goes in and out once you start a stage. Now, the common theory for this is that it just saves on time for the US players, but it's my theory that they changed this for perhaps a different reason. See, sometimes there's in-between stages where you go through a pipe only to get to a shortcut to a different part of the world map. And in the Japanese version, that cookie cutter effect behaves a little bit differently. Instead of black, it turns into that teal color, which doesn't look very good and doesn't really make sense for what the effect is trying to accomplish. And perhaps it was just an easy fix to remove it outright than to remove it for these sections alone. But again, that's just my theory. It is very possible that Nintendo just decided to respect the player's time. Now, we're back in the throne room. Oh my god, I'm telling you, there are so many changes to this room. I don't know if you noticed this up to now, but let's take a look. The top of the steps and the throne itself have a matching color to the back of the room, sporting that light blue color, whereas in the US version, the palette was changed to have a more golden regal kind of look. And then there's more pillars in the Japanese version. One of those was removed in the US version, and the far right pillar is in the background in the Japanese version, whereas it's in the foreground in the US version. The Japanese version also has a shadow cast that doesn't exist in the US version. Also, the pillar on the far left has the shadow drop facing the left in the Japanese version, where it's facing the right in the US version. Mario also stands in a different position depending on which version you play. In the Japanese version, he hangs all the way out in the back of the room, whereas in the US version, he's right at the bottom of the steps. And then it's hard to notice this because the dialogue boxes show up very quickly, but the triangular pattern that's in the background is also different between the two versions. The US version has smaller peaks and valleys, while the Japanese version has fewer peaks and valleys that are larger. Some of these changes may have been concessions to accommodate the larger text box that's needed for the US version, as the Japanese language can fit in more dialogue in shorter spaces. In fact, that smaller dialogue box extends itself to the toad houses. And not only that, Mario can move before the text box completely finishes in the Japanese version, whereas in the US version, he has to wait until every bit of dialogue is spoken. And this one's really cool. I don't know if you'd really consider this a difficulty change, so I decided to put it here in design. If you beat the game, the Japanese version stays on the end curtain. You can't even press any buttons to restart your game. You have to reset or turn off your console. Whereas in the US version, you push a button, it brings you back to the first world, and then your entire inventory is filled up with P-Wings. That is a feature that is exclusive to territories outside of Japan. The rare suits have a very unique thing happen to them in the Japanese version. If you get hit with a special suit in the Japanese version, a silhouette of that special item will fly off of Mario and play a unique sound effect. And that same effect will replace the Goomba shoe if you happen to be wearing a special suit. But here's another really cool fact. If Mario is not wearing one of the rare suits and he gets hit by something in the Japanese version, the Goomba shoe turns red. It consistently gets turned red no matter which power-up you have, assuming none of those power-ups are one of the rare ones. And while we're on the subject of rare suits and Goomba shoes, let's move on to glitches. Now, there's no doubt about it, there's a lot of glitches you can pull off in Super Mario 3, but most of the glitches are universal. There are a select few glitches that the developers took the time to fix from the Japanese version to the US version. So, let's talk about them. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about the Goomba shoe yet again, or in this case, the Karibo shoe, and exclusively to the Japanese version, if you have the Tanuki suit and you turn into stone above the shoe, you will land in the shoe and remain as stone inside the shoe. Your sprite even remains gray. And the cool thing is that you can't get hurt because it's using the functionality of being in the stone state, which is that you're invincible. But unfortunately, for as cool as it functions and looks, it puts you in a worse state than if you had never done the glitch at all. Because if you go over to any of the pipes, you'll see that you can't enter them. And even though it looks a little bit messy here, I can show you my controller inputs on the screen right down below. And yeah, pressing down on the pipe does nothing for you. Here's one of the tiniest little glitches that they took the time to fix. A lot of you probably can't even see it right now, but you're staring at it as we speak. In the Japanese version, there's a pixel on the letter R for world that is transparent instead of black. And so in daytime levels, you'll occasionally see some light blue instead of the standard black pixel like you'll see over here with the US version. This one is absolutely nuts. An entire level change had to be made in order to fix this glitch. So in level 5-1, there's a secret pipe right at the start where you can get a music box in a sub room. Now in the Japanese version of the game, that sub room is stored in the main stage, and so to prevent the players from just going there without the pipe, a giant wall is made and then you enter a pipe to come out the other side and complete the stage. Now I guess something they didn't think of correcting is that with a P-Wing, you can fly above the stage and start moving over to the left, which causes the box to appear. And heck, before I even finish this explanation, I'll even take the time to go all the way to the left so that you can see some of the room that I just showed you earlier. Like that's the room right there. It's crazy. So anyways, this glitch becomes problematic when you go to complete the stage because hitting the victory box seems to trigger the treasure box to appear. And if you hit the angle just right on the victory box, the treasure box will appear to your right instead of your left. And this is where it gets really funny. As Mario walks off screen, he's going to touch that treasure box. It causes a visual corruption on the screen. And then this is a really easy glitch, one that clearly needed to be fixed. In fact, I'm noticing that all the glitches that seem to be fixed from the Japanese to the US one are ones that would cause natural experimentation. And this one's no different. As you can see here, we use the warp whistle on the canoe in World 3. Now, in the US version, there's no problem with that. Everything works as intended. But in the Japanese version, Mario gets the functionality of the canoe and is able to get off the land and start exploring the water in the warp zone. Now, once Mario leaves the land, he's restricted of the borders of the land, much like the canoe naturally would. So you can't explore too far to the right or too far to the left, and you can never get back onto the island that shares all the warp pipes. So you essentially soft lock the game. And then lastly, this is a glitch that I found on my own during a live stream. I don't know if it's Japanese exclusive, but I played Mario 3 for years and years and years, and I've never replicated this glitch before. So I'm just willing to share it with you and just say it's a glitch that happened in the Japanese version that is inconclusive as to whether or not it can only be replicated in the Japanese version. But as I was playing the first world, I went to go get the Fire Flower power-up, and the block completely disappeared, which was really weird. And because there's no block there, the Fire Flower just started bouncing in place. And again, I can't verify if that's exclusive to the Japanese version, but I had to share it with you because it was really interesting. Now Super Mario Bros. 3 out of the way, let's talk about Super Mario Bros. World. So first I thought we'd start with the title screen because there's like a million things different about this. Let's start with the most obvious thing. The Super Mario World logo has a much deeper drop shadow in the Japanese version, which also means that the text in general for Super Mario World is different from both versions. They're also placed a little bit differently. So when you fade in from one version to another, you can see that the US version is a little bit more in the upper left-hand corner. Moving on, you got the trademark on the very end there, and for the Japanese version, it's black, and for the US version, it's blue and a lot thicker. And the copyright years at the bottom only has 1990 for the Japanese version, and for the US version it has 1990 and 1991. And believe it or not, we're still not done here. If you paid very close attention to the wooden planks, they seem to have been altered slightly to make it more obvious that that's what they are. There's more use of an effect that shows holes within the wood planks, and if you're still not seeing it, the easiest way to tell the difference between the two planks, the US version looks like a fish man with his mouth wide open, whereas the Japanese version looks like that same plank of wood has its mouth closed. I just hope that you could see what I see. Moving on, the Yoshi sign that we all know and love right at the start of the game has Japanese text on the sign for the Japanese version, which makes perfect sense. Also, we will get into translations later, but one visual difference between the two versions is that Yoshi kind of signs his name with a paw print in the US version, whereas there's nothing like that at all for the Japanese version. Reznor in the US version, of course, has the name Reznor on the sign, and the name of the Reznor in the Japanese version is Bui Bui. So, you know, it only makes sense that the Japanese name would be on there. Still an absolutely bizarre boss. Bowser's light up neon sign in the US version is replaced by Koopa, and this is because in Japan, that is the name of the main antagonist. Simple enough. Now here's something that's really bizarre. The credits are really different between the two versions. Mostly just the titles, not the names of the people credited. Like the main director in the US version is known as the total director in the Japanese version. The area director in the US version is known as the course director over in Japan. Background programmer in the US version is still background programmer in the Japanese version. It's just programmer is spelled differently and background is spaced out. And that misspelling was also fixed for the map programmer. I'm not going to point out the obvious pun here, but if anybody wants to leave it in the comments section, I'll be sure to hit love on that comment. Anyways, area data input for the US version was originally course editor, which I feel like gets the point across a lot better. Character graphic designer was changed from CG designer, and for the special thanks to section, a colon was added to the US version, and there's also a singular person that was added to the US version, Dave Brooks. Anyways, keeping with the theme of the graphics being different, Princess Peach in particular went through a lot of changes for some weird reason. In the US version, Princess Peach when she walks over has two different frames of animation, one that is identical to the Japanese version, but then another where she has a more muted expression. In the US version, Princess Peach's kiss has more of a wider side profile, whereas in the Japanese version she looks more normal. And why would the developers make this change? Well, it's probably to better illustrate that she's actually kissing Mario. Whereas in the Japanese version, I guess it could be misunderstood as like a hug or something, like her lips don't quite reach Mario, though I feel that blush from Mario kind of tells it all. And of course, this isn't a regional difference, but it's a revisional difference that I think is really interesting. A lot of US players are going to know this already, and please, if this information was new and interesting to you, let me know, just so that I can vibe whether or not it was worth putting into the episode. But Luigi in the Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World version has been completely resprited to resemble more of the physique of Luigi, whereas in any other version before this, Luigi was simply green Mario. And for as much as the game tries to emulate Mario's movements but with Luigi for Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, when you finish a level, it has a completely unique pose from what he had in the original versions, opting to cross his arms instead of doing the victory sign. Also, because they resprited Luigi, he no longer has to have a green tongue, because as you can see here, Mario utilized his red palette for his outfit to give himself a red tongue, but the developers weren't really thinking that far ahead with Luigi, thus his tongue does the same thing and just uses the off color when his mouth is open. These are all changes that are different between each level. And to start with, Donut Plains 2 has a change that's pretty good for beginners. Right at the start of it, in the US version, they added a yellow exclamation block. The players can start off a little bit easy and have a mushroom, whereas in the Japanese version, that doesn't exist. And then in the second area, the US version added a very random cape feather power-up. Maybe the developers found through testing that a lot of players lost their power-up in this particular area and wanted to give something back to the player. Or heck, the fact that it's a cape power-up really helps out against these enemies in a way that a fire plant power-up wouldn't. And then for the third castle, or Lemmy's Castle, they gave you an extra 100 seconds to get through this area, which I have to say was a really smart change, considering the fact that in the US version, I ran out the timer pretty much all the time. So I can only imagine having 100 seconds less would be even more of a nightmare for a more inexperienced player. Meanwhile, on Chocolate Island 3, there are 3 arrows in the US version trying to strongly hint where you need to go, whereas the Japanese version has 1 arrow sign. Sadly, neither one of these do a great job of illustrating where the player really needs to get going. Maybe if one of these signs was an up arrow with a cross through it, but as it stands, they tried their best. Moving on, the ghost ship, just before you get to the final area, there's a whole body of water underneath where that question mark orb is. And in the Japanese version, there's nothing down there. But for the US version, there's a total of 3 different 1-ups that you could possibly get before it sinks all the way to the bottom, which may beg the question, why bother doing something like that? And again, this is just speculation, but the fact that there's nothing in there at all in the Japanese version is kind of lackluster, and that body of water does entice the player to have a sense of exploration. The other theory could just be that absent-minded players that made it that far only to die maybe felt a little bit too cruel, and the developers tried to put in a safeguard to at least reward the player to give another try. And then the secret boo house that can take you to Star Road has a graphical error that the developers decided to fix for the international version. One of the lesser popular features of the game, if you hold the left or right shoulder button, you can pan the camera to the left or right. And sadly, in the Japanese version, if you do that in this particular spot, you can see a break in the boundary, and the developers decided to fix this boundary break over in the US version. And this one is awesome. We got a little bit of English in the Japanese version for basically the final level of the game. And we'll keep playing this footage over for you, but if you focus your attention over on the Japanese side, it says, "You are super player." But somebody over on the US team was clearly a stickler for grammar and decided to go through the trouble of adding more coins to this area so that it says, "You are a super player." That has to be the truest sentiment of how far a grammar stickler will go when it comes to an opportunity to correct someone. And I just wanted to talk about this really quick. It doesn't really go with our theme at the moment, but I'm sure you don't mind. After you beat the game, it does a roll call for all the enemies that you faced. And what's really fascinating is that it has all the name differences written out in English letters, and you can see all the differences here. To kind of go through these pretty quick, I'm just going to name off some of the more interesting ones in Japan, like P. Pakun, KK, Killer. Instead of Megamole, it's Indie, and instead of Bonsai Bill, it's Magnum Killer. I like that it's Raita and Chibi Raita. We got Fugu Manon, which Fugu is Japanese for blowfish, I believe. Instead of Rip Van Fish, it's Gooska. The Boo Buddies were known as Talisa. Fish and Boo is known as Spook. The Big Boo is known as Atomic Talisa. Dry Bones were known as Karen. What? And weirdest of all, the Koopalings or Koopa Kids all had their names expanded in the US version, with Morton Koopa Jr. and Ludwig von Koopa being particularly interesting. Also, a big difference here is that when you clear the game after you've gotten the special world, the special enemies get their own names in the US version, whereas in the Japanese version, they just hold the same names as the enemies that they've replaced. Anyways, here's one of the weirdest changes, I have to say. Once again, on the last stage, the fruit that Yoshi eats gets replaced with better fruit in the US version. In many places where there's red fruit in the Japanese version, here you can see that green fruit. And now we're going to look at differences between the localization versus a more straight to the point translation. These translations were provided by Stella Swift, so thank you so much if you're watching this. First thing I want to look at is all the dialogue for every single castle that you take down. The very first one has some really interesting stuff. In the US version, it says Mario has defeated the demented Iggy Koopa in castle number 1 and has rescued Yoshi's friend who is still trapped in an egg. Together, they now travel to Donut Land. But the Japanese version reads out more like at Yoster Island, which, by the way, Yoster Island was something that was used in the Japanese version of Yoshi's Island, which I had no idea. Sorry, anyways, it says Mario defeated the first Ko-Koopa, which is the way that the Japanese refer to the Koopalings. Mario and Ko saved their friend who was trapped in an egg by Koopa's magic, Koopa being Bowser, and set off for Donut Plains. Now, Koopa's obviously Bowser, as we just established, and it's here that we see a huge difference. See, in the US version, there's no mention of magic. However, in Japan, that's a pretty strong detail that lends itself better to the ending of the game. Now, we skipped the second castle because it's relatively the same. So for the third one, it says Mario has triumphed over Lemmy Koopa of castle number 3. Mario's quest is starting to get much more difficult. Have you found the red and green switches yet? yet. And already you can see in the Japanese text, the punctuation's a little bit different. And it reads, Mario and company defeat the third Ko-Koopa and sigh a breath of relief. But the courses from here will become much more intense. If the green and red switches aren't flipped, what kind of journey will this turn out to be? For Ludwig's castle, it says Ludwig von Koopa's days of composing Koopa symphonies in the castle number 4 are over. The forest of illusion lies ahead. Mario must use his brain to solve the puzzle of the perplexing forest. This one is much different. Once again, not referring to the Koopaling by name. It says, somehow having cleared the 4th Ko-Koopa, Mario and company are moving on to the forest of wandering? It's a mysterious forest that one cannot leave unless they solve its mysteries. Will they really be able to escape the forest? And as you're probably starting to see, these are reading out more like cliffhangers to an action show, which seems to be completely deliberate, as there's even evidence on the back of the game's box. The body of text that's underneath Super Mario World reads, one peaceful day, Mario, Luigi, and Peach set off on a vacation in the southern island, Dinosaur Land, Yoster's Island. At least they were, until once again the great demon King Koopa appears. His magic is cast on the island's dinosaurs, and Princess Peach has ended up kidnapped. Now this is bad. The remaining pair, Mario and Luigi, join forces with the mysterious dragon Yoshi, and their action movie adventures facing Koopa's army unfold. It continues on the Super Famicom. See, that action movie reference clearly plays into how these chapter dividers set the tone of the game. The ending dialogue here says, Mario's adventure is over. Mario, the princess, Yoshi, and his friends are going to take a vacation. And with the Japanese version, it's phrased more like, and with that, Mario's adventure comes to an end. With their Yoshi friends, he and Peach once again begin their fun vacation. ... So to summarize the big differences between the two stories is that originally Bowser's magic is what was trapping all these Yoshis and eggs, and Mario and Princess Peach were having a vacation on Yoshi's Island, which when you end the game, they continue that vacation on Yoshi's Island. And then for Yoshi's note in his house, he says, hello, sorry I'm not home, but I've gone to rescue my friends who were captured by Bowser, Yoshi, which has that handprint that I mentioned earlier. And the Japanese one reads, welcome, I've gone away on a journey to save my friends from Koopa. Those who have business with me, too bad. Super Dragon Yoshi. And a couple of things to note here. Super Dragon is written out to sound like English words. So it'd be like Super Dragon. And then I wanted to mention this because it's pretty cool. The special zone stages have very different naming conventions between the US version and the Japanese version. As evidenced in the Super Mario 3 episode, which by the way, if you haven't seen, I will definitely have links to. They seem to love to communicate with their audience directly, whereas that seems to get a little bit scrubbed out in the US versions. And you'll see that in just a second. Going in order here, the name of the first stage in the US is Gnarly, but it's named Fun Course in Japan. The next stage is Tubular, and once again, the stage name is just Fun Course. You might have noticed that the characters over on the Japanese side did not change at all, but when you move over one more, in the US it's Way Cool, but in Japan it reads out as Mario's staff is just as surprised course, as if to say they're just as surprised as you are. The next one in the US is Awesome, whereas once again, like I said, same in Japanese as the last one. Moving on from there, it's Groovy, and in Japan it reads out as Specialist Only Course. The next stage in the US is Mondo, and staying true to themselves, like mentioned in the past, the name of the stage is the same as the last one. Next up is Outrageous, which was named Championships Course in Japan. And lastly, in the US, it's Funky, only for it to be named once again the same as the last course in Japan. Okay, for the box segment, we're going to go through things at a more brisk pace than we usually do. First thing I want to just show you is differences in the boxes themselves. Super Famicom boxes have a vertical look, whereas in the US, they decided to put it on its side essentially and have them look a lot wider. The front of the box has unique artwork that's not featured in the US version in any capacity, including the manual, and seems to feature a world that has illustrations of various things that you'll encounter throughout the game. Also, big difference here. Folks over in Japan got 2 titles essentially. Sure, it still says Super Mario World, but it also says Super Mario Bros. 4, which to me, that's wild. Anyways, on the back, there's another piece of completely unique artwork, once again, not featured at all in the US manual or box, that seems to have a map. And the map is even labeled as Super Mario World. It's incredibly cool that in order to look at the game's quote-unquote manual, you have to unfold it, which, as you can see here, it gets a little bit crazy. But what you're treated with is a giant map of the world itself, which is pretty cool. Now, this is featured in the US manual. And in fact, outside of the layout, just about every bit of artwork that's used in this manual is used in the US manual as well. So let's move over to that real quick. Does the US version have any unique artwork for itself? Well, surprisingly, yeah. All the way in the very back, there appears to be unique artwork artwork of the Koopalings, which once again feature their expanded names. And without going neck deep into it, just want to also state while you're looking at the artwork here that the Japanese version story synopsis once again cements that the Yoshi's being stuck in eggs is caused by magic, whereas the Super Nintendo version once again does not allude to this whatsoever. Anyways, I want to move on to differences in gameplay. Over here is a huge difference. Though they're not very common in Super Mario World, there are dolphins in both versions, with one major defining difference. In the Japanese version, you could eat the dolphins with Yoshi, whereas in the US version, you couldn't. Now, I don't think you'd be in too much trouble, honestly, if you ate a ton of dolphins in the Japanese version. So I think this change was honestly made to accommodate sensitivity towards animal cruelty towards dolphins, which culturally has a much higher sensitivity to the US over Japan. Also, in the European version, the 1-ups move way faster than they do in the US version, which is a huge surprise. Of all the things for the European version to be different from the other versions, I can't believe it's that. And also, between the US and the Japanese version, there's a little trick you can use in the US version to play the castle levels over again. And it's by pressing L and R, but in the Japanese version, you can't do that. And in fact, to prove that, right now on the screen, you can see what my button inputs are. Like if I press A, you'll see A, and if I press L and R, you'll definitely see that. So keep a close eye here and you'll see that when I press L and R in the US version, I get brought into the stage, whereas in Japan, it's not possible. Hey, so I asked you guys on Twitter, what would be the next game that we should look at the regional differences for? And someone said Super Mario Sunshine. I thought, Super Mario Sunshine? That can't possibly have that many differences. Well, just to make sure, I did a quick reference to the Cutting Room Floor, a fantastic website, and I was shocked. You know what's the section you have to check out first? Like the most insane section of them all? Believe it or not, it's the differences in sound. Yeah, there's a few sound effect differences, and we'll get to that. But first, you gotta hear full-on dialogue that was just stripped out of the US version. Here. Take a listen. Did you hear that? Here, I'll bump up the audio for you.
Looks like a giant tentacle.
Pretty sure he's saying it looks like a giant tentacle, which really doesn't make sense in the context of a giant pile of goo. And yeah, over on the US side, this is how it plays out. Here's another full part of dialogue that gets played in the Japanese version.
Excuse me,
I am most
Gonna enhance the audio for you here so you can hear it as best you can.
I imagine you'll be spending a fair amount of time at the princess's side.
look like a Mario's gonna have to find a job.
Trying to start a new career at...
And here's the US version.
I am most...
And I think even the original intention of the Japanese version was to mute it down quite a bit so that it sounded like it was muffled to the Japanese player. It's pretty clear that they wanted to get rid of it for some strong reason. Now this next one makes a ton of sense. In the Japanese version, the voice actor for the lawyer actually gets his lines wrong. Every time the word shine is mentioned, the actor accidentally says shrine.
Expert shrine scholars have determined that this dark, the shrine sprites have vanished from their gathering spot at the shrine gate.
And I'm assuming that the voice director for this game was probably Japanese and it slipped through, because when you listen to the US audio, it's fixed. And when you hear them back to back like this, it's very obvious that the actor had to completely redo the lines, as you can hear subtle inflections that are a little different between the two different takes.
Expert shine scholars have determined that the shine sprites have vanished from their gathering spot at the shrine gate. The shrine sprites have vanished from their gathering spot at the shrine gate.
And next up is the cannon to Pinna Park. Assuming this is just a glitch of some kind, but in the Japanese version, Mario screams before he even gets shot out of the cannon. And it does seem a lot more appropriate in the US version where he does scream as he's being shot out. Also, for some reason, the sound effect for picking up any flood upgrades is different between the two versions. Here's the Japanese version. And here's the US version. And here's one more for the sound category. Whenever Shadow Mario steals Flood, the sound effect for him snatching the Flood is different between the two versions. Here in the US version, it has more of a chunkier feel to it. Whereas in the Japanese version, it's a little more wimpy. which maybe for the sake of making it feel a little less uncanny, they decided to give the sound effect a little more weight. And now, let's move on to the box differences. All right, the physical boxes. It's gonna be a short segment this time. A lot of what's in the manuals are nearly identical. So let's just sort of flash fire through all the big differences here. Aside from the obvious being the sizes and the format because of the two different regions, the discs are slightly different, with the clouds being white in the Japanese version and CD reflective in the US version. And the Japanese version is all clouds, while the US version uses a black background to show off all the information. The lines on the white part of the cover have a shining effect in the Japanese version, but it's just a print in the US version. And both versions have toads on the back, but only the Japanese version has a map of Delfino Island. Anyways, let's move on to environmental differences. This one should be a lot of fun. In the US version, they added a lot more fruit all over the island. And so in things like the fountains, decks, and wherever else, you can find a nice good variety of fruits. I guess this is because in the Japanese version, it might have been very confusing to younger players, having to go a couple blocks over to find any fruits at all. In fact, I may not be a small child, but just trying to find the fruits on my go around caused me to visit an island that's way too far away from the Yoshis. And I would constantly lose the fruit that I was trying to carry back to get my Yoshi, not realizing it was a lot closer than that. So good decision on the localizers, I will say. Also, this one is super interesting. The signboards in the two different regions are completely different. Over in the US, we have a series of symbols that cannot be deciphered in any way. It's just artwork. However, in Japan, English words. And if it weren't for the cutting room floor, I would have never known what the heck this was supposed to say. So again, big thank you to them. Anyways, what it ended up being was an example sentence from a dictionary. And it says, "This isn't gonna hurt a bit, just a little stick. Ready? 1, 2, 3. There you go, all done. First thing you see when you boot up the game is the Nintendo logo. For the US, it's that iconic red color, and apparently in Japan, it's this iconic blue color for them. Immediately following that, Japan had it say Super Mario Sunshine and then Nintendo Presents underneath, and for it to read out a little more normally for us, it's just completely flipped, where it says Nintendo Presents Super Mario Sunshine. And then in the opening cutscene, they changed the name from Dolphic Island in Japan to Isle Delfino, and so all of the artwork that was made Dolphic Island had to be remade to say Isle Delfino, creating almost like an alternate universe for people in the US. And what's really funny is that, yeah, it says Isle Delfino on the map as well, but oddly enough, they took it even further than that. There's a little bit of tourist text in two of the corners of the map, and both of them say something completely different in English between the two versions. In Japanese, it says, "Welcome to Dolphic Island, the last resort of this century, and the southern paradise filled with the glittering sunshine, limpid ocean, fresh green mountains, and more. Dolphic Tourist Association is proud to present you a romantic vacation. Feel free to contact us." Whereas in the US, it says, "Welcome to Isle Delfino, the glittering jewel of the southern seas. The sun is always shining here, so come and visit. Picturesque bays, rolling hills, quaint villages, and more await you. Contact Delfino Tours and plan your vacation today." I'm gonna guess that this was changed because I guess the original Japanese version had sort of maybe implied that Mario and Princess were on a romantic vacation together, whereas in the US, they seem to scrub that out. Another interesting thing is that both the US and the Japanese version use special symbols to represent the controller buttons that it would ask you to press to accomplish certain things in the game. And for the US localization, they decided to make the buttons look more accurate towards how they would look on your GameCube controller. Also, the options menu at the start screen has an extra option in the US version and also moves the GameCube controller over to the left instead of having it over onto the right like it does in the Japanese version. And there's even more changes in the European version, which includes a set of languages. And then this is pretty crazy. A lot of the areas that you go to in the game have some stuff that resembles portals, and they have sort of like a window into the area that you're about to go into. And for some reason, the Japanese version had the little FMV that would play for it changed for the US version for 3 of the locations. One of these makes sense because if you look very closely for at least the first level, you could see an object in this FMV that did not make it into the final game. And so for the US version, it seems that they used the final assets of the game to redo all these little FMVs that play. All right, let's talk about things that changed that were English words between both the Japanese version and the US version. To start with, we got the episodes versus the stories. Yeah, if you select a Shine Sprite in the Japanese version, it's known as a story. However, over in the US, they call it episodes. And at the very bottom of the same screen, the Japanese version says My Score, whereas the US version just says Score. You also may notice that the name of the area is different between the two versions. That's the case for 3 different areas in this game. Gelato Beach in the US is known as Mama Beach, Pianta Village is known as Monte Village, and Noki Bay is known as Mare Bay. And when you're just about to lose your Yoshi, the two versions say something completely different. They both say juice at first, but once it's down to the bottom, the US version says fruit, whereas the Japanese version says hungry, which is so bizarre. You would think that they would keep that, as it seems to illustrate a lot better what the Yoshi needs than just saying fruit. Then if you lose a round, it says too bad in the US version and miss in the Japanese version. And when you collect a shine sprite, in the US it says shine, whereas in Japan it originally said shine get. And now on the translation side of things, we got our friend Quentin back from the Legend of Zelda 1 episode that I did. And out of all the things that I sent over to Quentin, the best stuff that I found was this police officer that says, "Get going, clean up Bianco Square and make it snappy." I swear, graffiti artists make me so mad. But in Japan, the police officer is actually a lot nicer, saying, "You carry the perfect tool for cleaning. Pew pew! And get rid of it with that." And then funny enough, in the first level that you go to, this Pianta, just before PD Piranha, has the script flipped. The one in the US is nice, and the one in Japan is not. For the US, he says, "Could you help out with the big-headed creature up there? You're the only one we can ask to lend us a hand." I know it's a pain, but do you think you can handle it? Whereas in Japan, it says, "Could you help with the big-headed guy up there? You're the only one we can ask. You're so undependable, I'm worried. Are you okay?" And then there's the episode titles. There's many that are different, but I just want to give you one example where it clearly has English words in the Japanese version. It says go go and then something in Japanese. So when translated, it says go go squid surfing. And obviously way different than the US's blooper surfing safari. And then lastly, I want to take it all the way back to the beginning. Let's talk about the title screen. In the US, it's very unique in that it has press and start on opposite ends of the logo. There's also a little sun to represent the O in Mario, something that the Japanese version does not have. The Japanese version has its press start on the bottom of the logo, and it also says Super Mario Sunshine in English just below Super Mario Sunshine in Japanese. And this is also where we'll talk about the European version that also has its own unique logo. Super Mario is in big letters, Sunshine is in small letters, and the Shine Sprite is next to Sunshine instead of hanging above the S of Sunshine. It also shares the same press start with the Japanese version. Okay, now we gotta talk about Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64 because, whew, some of these differences are absolutely insane. I will tell you that. Why don't we jump right into it and hit you with one of our 4 categories here, which is sound. And again, we're picking sound because this is one of the most absurd things that I've seen in any episodes that I've covered so far. So we'll talk about Super Mario Kart whenever it's relevant to whatever topic we're talking about. But in this topic, this is pretty much exclusive to Mario Kart 64. So let's get into it. The first thing I have to mention is the announcer voice when you pick an option from the menu. In the US, you might remember that it's voiced by Mario,
Mario Grand Prix.
which was an excellent choice from what was originally recorded. Originally, it was just a generic announcer, and I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison of Mario versus this Japanese announcer that is speaking English, and you can judge for yourself which one's better.
Option. Data. Mario Grand Prix. Time trials. Option. Data. Mario Grand Prix. Time attack. Versus battle. Select your player. Select map.
Versus battle. Select your player. Select map.
Also, the main title screen was once again voiced by Mario in the US version, but in the Japanese original version, it was voiced by a chorus of children. Check it out.
Welcome to Mario Kart.
And half the roster was recast and revoiced. So I'm just going to let the characters do the talking for me, but I am going to introduce them. The first one we're going to talk about here is Luigi.
Yahoo! Ho ho! Bingo! Bingo! Ho ho ho! Here we go! Bingo! Yahoo! Yahoo! Here we go! Mamma mia! Here we go! Here we go! Yahoo! Oh, ow, 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 ow! I'm Luigi, number 1. Luigi is the best!
And now here's Princess Peach.
Let's go! Take that! Bingo! Bye-bye! Get lady!
Here's Toad.
Yahoo! Here we go! Yahoo! Here we go! Yahoo! Here we go! Yahoo! Here we go! Woo! Yeah! Woo! Yeah! I'm the best! I'm the best!
And here's Wario.
Here I go! Here I go!
Here we go!
I'm Wario. I'm gonna win.
Mario, I'm gonna win!
All right, so we'll start off in order with Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo. And right here on the front, you can see a tagline that says, "Where racing becomes an adventure." And on all sides of the box, you can see key art of various characters. I already showed you the Koopa and the Lakitu. And here is Bowser with a red shell hitting him. And on the last side here, we can also see Toad. But anyways, let's read the back of the box. Starts off with saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. The Super Mario Go-Kart Park is open for fun. Master the unique driving styles of Mario, Luigi, and the Princess. Drag with Donkey Kong Jr. Crash with the King of Koopas. Lock fenders with Yoshi. You can race head-to-head with a friend or against the computer in great split-screen Mode 7 trademark graphics. Do you have what it takes to win the Gold Cup in the challenging Star Circuit? It's as much fun to drive as it is to win. Feel like a bit less speed and a lot more strategy? Take a crack at the battle mode. In 4 different maze-like courses, you'll use Koopa shells, banana peels, superstars, and other wacky weapons to burst your opponent's target balloons and triumph. 2 games in 1, Mario Grand Prix and Battle Mode. 8 familiar characters, 20 different tracks, 3 different skill levels, and battery-backed memory to save your best times. Anyways, let's open this box here and show you that there is a cart that has similar artwork to the one that was on the front of the box. Also, we have the US style manual with a lot of black, and then a print of the US style box. On the first page, you'll see a Lakitu, and it says, "Introduction. Hi everybody, thanks for dropping by the Super Mario Kart racetrack. My name is Lakitu. I run this track. If you need my help, I'll be around. We race 1-seater metal pipe frame go-karts here. There are 2 engine sizes to choose from, 50cc or 100cc. All the go-karts are more or less the same. It's the individual drivers that make up the difference when it comes to winning. Each driver has their own strengths and weaknesses. Try using different drivers until you find the one that's best for you." And the white text here says, "This game has a battery-backed memory that saves the best time trial times and keeps track of which trophy cups you have earned. If you switch the game pack on and off repeatedly, you may erase the saved information." And then you'll see beautiful cell art of, I believe most of the ones that are used here were used in past games. I might be wrong about that. Though I will say this art of a Koopa Troopa is the most adorable version of the Koopa Troopa I've ever seen, and I can't really say for sure if I've ever seen that in any other game before. But where I was unsure about that, I can say from here forth, the rest of the artwork was made uniquely for Super Mario Kart. And try to remember this image here for later. We'll get to that. But as you can see here, this unique artwork of Mario playing battle mode with Bowser, as well as doing some drifting, collecting coins, Yoshi looking like he's spinning out, and then we got descriptions of the drivers. Now this is really cool. I won't go through reading all the descriptions, but I will take the time to mention all these little nicknames they have, like the Bros, which has Mario and Luigi, the Dragon and the Lady, which has Princess Peach and Yoshi, the Showdown with Bowser and Donkey Kong Jr., and the Small Guys featuring the Koopa and Toad. Here's something that will be different from the Japanese version, so take a note of it. In the US manual, when talking about the Ghost Valley slipperiness, it says absent in the box that has an X. And then it shows you the name of the various racetracks, which is pretty cool. And at the very end, there's some master tips featuring Mario getting pulled out of the water by Lakitu. And that's that. Let's move on to the Japanese box now. And there's that unique artwork that was only featured inside the manual of the US version, which I will say is pretty nice that they managed to include that in the US manual in some form. One thing that you will notice that if you compare the artwork of this box with the box that was for the US one, they pretty much had to redraw all the characters, and some of them are in very similar poses, but 100% they were all redone. Anyways, looking on the back of the box, it has its own description, which was graciously translated by 3Frame Window. I do really appreciate that. Anyways, let's see what the translation says. At the top it says, use items to deal with attacks from your rival. Nail corners with drift. Little body filled with excitement, referring to the karts. Super action racing is born. And then the text that's over Mario says, the colorful world of motorsports. From their variety of events, it's time for kart racing. The entry roster is 8 racers of 4 types in 24 unique tracks. Our familiar drivers will use everything they got to win, including Koopa shells and banana peels. You can have fun in 5 game modes for 1 player or 2 players in Mario Kart, no matter if you're a racing newbie or a veteran. Let's go to the start line together. And again, we'll open it up here, and now you'll see that the sticker label for the cartridge is different from that on the front of the box, unlike the US version. This one has that artwork of Mario drifting, and you're going to start to notice that there's all sorts of different types of art that gets repurposed in the US media. One other thing that's kind of interesting too is that included with this set is a cardboard card that describes all the items you can get, and it explains the controls of the game on the back. But anyways, opening up the game manual, there's also a message here similar to the US one, but it reads out a little bit differently. It says, hi everyone, welcome to the race venue of Super Mario Kart today. I am the starter, judge, and helper for all the karts that fall out of the stage in this event. Basically, I look after all the drivers, and my name is Jugemu. And naming the character Jugemu has quite the backstory for it if you're not familiar with Japanese culture. So first of all, Jugemu is a famous rakugo story, and a rakugo is what you're seeing here on the screen. It's a form of Japanese spoken entertainment where a lone storyteller will usually show up on stage and tell a story. And so the plot of Jugemu is 2 parents that couldn't think of a name for their newborn son, and the father went to a temple and asked the priest to come up with a name. The priest suggests Jugemu and several other names, and the father could not decide which, so instead he gave the baby all of the names all at once as the name. Here's a pre-made little meme that I saw on Google. Honestly, none of you want to hear me botch all these Japanese words, but as you can see here, it's a ridiculous length, and that's the whole point of the story. But why would a Lakitu be named Jugemu? Well, there's different variations of that story, and it's often theorized by Japanese fans of the game that it's a version where, in a less gruesome version, Jugemu falls into a lake due to the people that found him drowning in the lake took so long to try to say out his name, and his parents barely arrive in time to save him, which I'm sure that's the version that inspired the name of this Lakitu. And the reason for that is that the Lakitu does take the time to get the kart racers out of the lake, and he even makes a point to say this in his description in the game manual. Also interesting to note, Paipo is one of the names that is part of Jugemu's full name, as you can see here again with that meme. And Paipo is the name of the Spiney's eggs that the Lakitu throws out. It's all interconnected. It also says, by the way, my real name is Fishing Jugemu. It's a pleasure to meet you. As you're probably noticing as I'm flipping through the pages here, they did not reuse any old artwork for this manual of Super Mario Kart. Unlike the US version, every piece of line art that you see here is uniquely made and in later use in the US manual as well. But there is one thing that is really unique to this manual. Occasionally there are haikus. This one next to Mario says, "It is addicting when you were nailing a drift, such high pleasure." And then in this manual, Yoshi's actually saying something. And what he's saying here is, "Give me," with the exclamation point, and then it says coin ... And interesting to note, it's English in katakana form. And the haiku next to him says, "If I saved it up, I will not ever let it go. This coin." And then we have something similar to the US manual, except all the descriptions are slightly different. For Mario and Luigi, it says Showdown of Brothers. And then for Princess Peach and Yoshi, it says Showdown of Beauty and Dinosaur. For King Koopa and Donkey Kong Jr., it says Showdown of the Big. And then for the Koopa and Toad, it says Showdown of the Side Characters, which could also be translated to supporting characters. And there's the X that I told you about with the US manual. It doesn't have any text inside of it whatsoever, and it's a completely different colored X as well. Here again are some various tips, but here's something that I found really interesting. The ape logo was in this yellow box, so I asked to have it translated, and the entire thing translates to Nintendo Official Guidebook with the red font. And then in the blue font, it says editing and planning done by Ape and Shogakan. Ape famously worked on the Mother series, which again, I had no idea that they had any involvement with Super Mario Kart. And then Shogakan is a big famous Japanese publisher, known best for Detective Conan. And then here it just kind of talks about the guidebook a bit. It says full reveal of all course maps, character-specific guides, the ultimate winning strategy for 2 players. Of course, we have course-specific advice for Time Attack. You can also read fun manga about Mario. This is the advent of only the official guide. And then the blue font says, plan to be available in September, price to be announced. Now I gotta buy the player's guide so I can check out this manga. I will definitely be picking that up at some point. That'd be interesting to translate. Anyways, moving on to the N64 versions, Mario Kart 64 for the US. This one also has unique 3D artwork on all sides of the binder of the box. And on the back it says, 3, 2, 1, go. The signal light changes and you drop the pedal to the metal. Take on up to 3 friends in the split screen versus games, or race solo in the Mario Kart Grand Prix. Tell your friends to bring it on in the highly competitive battle mode. Advanced features allow you to race with your quote-unquote ghost. No longer must you race simply against the clock. You can finally race against yourself. The manual actually has a revision if you bought the player's choice version. It's a lot more boring, but the original release had this gorgeous looking cover that wraps around the entire thing, so if you open it up like this, you can see one large image with Wario, Bowser, Peach, and Toad. It's pretty cool. Again, lots of fantastic art being used here. There's also a little image of Lakitu that says it's time to start. You can see here all the characters are named, and when you check out the Japanese manual, you will see the Japanese variants to all these names. It's kind of interesting. Lots of great, unique art made for these manuals that you wouldn't be able to see if you only bought the cart or played on a virtual console. Definitely worth at least giving you a look here. And lots of zoom out shots of various courses. You know me, I love me some good zoom outs, so all these pictures are kind of fantastic with deep descriptions of so many of these. And that's all there is to really note for the US one. The Japanese box, however, oh, we got a lot to talk about. This thing is beefy, isn't it? It's because it comes with its own unique controller with a black top and a gray bottom. You can see the characters' names in a tire behind Mario, and if you look at the binder, you can see a lot of that unique art used in the US manual in complete full. It is really quite lovely, I must say. Well, anyways, the seller was nice enough to include the controller, so we'll put that aside. And outside of that is a normal N64 size box and has a lot of stuff written on the back, so I'm gonna read this out to you as well. The red font with the black border says, everyone's in a heated mood. Playing just by yourself is a waste. The white font with a green border says, the famous Mario Kart Rush in the N64 with a huge power-up, lasting action of fun characters, stacked game modes, satisfying 4-player functionality. Battle mode comes back as well. It's almost too fun. And then the yellow font with the purple border says, more exciting by connecting 4 controllers. That's a lot better. I have no idea what was going on with the localizers in the West. Anyways, opening it up, you'll see that the label does match the cover of both the large box and the smaller box. The game manual also features its own unique, wonderful looking art. And if we open it up the same way we did for the US one, we don't get the same effect. We have Mario giving us a nice thumbs up as he's driving away. But here you can see the various characters' alternate names. They also were nice enough to write them out in Japanese, but we'll get to all that a little bit later. The manual is relatively the same to the US one, and funny enough, if you look at the credits in the back of the manual here, Charles Martinet is credited in English, but they spelled his name wrong. It's really unfortunate. All right, let's move on to the next subject. Next one I would like to talk about is something that's really fascinating, and this is something that will span both games, and that subject is sprite changes. So now that we're on to sprites, let's talk about one that's the most interesting of all. You're looking at it right now and you may not even realize it. It's Yoshi. For whatever reason, Nintendo decided we gotta fatten up Yoshi for the US release, which means he gets changed from all sides. And so what you're seeing here for the side view is Yoshi's eyes are more wide in the Japanese release, and his knee seems to poke out further over his arm. Either that or his arm is a lot thinner. But yeah, a very unusual choice, one that's very clearly not necessary at all. But you're gonna see the easiest discrepancy right here when the camera is angled behind Yoshi. Going to blow up the image super large to show you that his cheeks kind of puff out in the US version. Now, where I don't agree that the Yoshi change was particularly necessary, these next two things I'm going to show you were very, very necessary. As is tradition for winning a race, the person in first gets a bottle of champagne. And as you can see here, in Japan, Bowser, or Koopa, is guzzling the bottle of champagne, which is a bit of a surprise, but you might be more surprised to find out a character that is not so devious enjoying an entire bottle of champagne in a family-friendly game, and that's Princess Peach. Her face even becomes flushed after drinking. I can't believe this. And are there any sprite changes in Mario Kart 64? Well, not on the characters themselves, but the billboards all got a huge overhaul. And the reason for this is that in Japan, they decided it'd be a great idea to do parodies of various corporation logos. Whereas when they decided to localize it, they weren't playing around. They decided, no, we don't want to get sued. Let's keep this out. Let's revise this and just make it so that it's entirely our own and we don't have to worry about this. And so as a result, we got the Marioro, which is a parody of Marlboro, changed to Mario Star. Got a parody of the AG IP, changed to Luigi IP, and that was changed to Luigi's for the international release. Another parody of Mobile, which was changed to Yoshi with a 1, and for the US release, it's just Yoshi with his paw print. Koopa Air is a parody of the Goodyear company, and for the international release, it just changed the color composition. And as for flat signs, the Nintendo logo went from blue to red, which is now the second time in this series where a Nintendo logo had a different color in the Japanese release, although in the Animal Crossing episode that I'm referring to, it was white and not blue. And for this last one, I had to look up online as to why they would even change this. I didn't recognize this parody, so big thank you to the Cutting Room Floor. I'll leave a link to that website in the video description. And apparently in Japan, it was an orange ball with a blue 64, which was a parody of the 76 gas station. And once again, just to kind of remove that affiliation, it was changed to a blue ball with a white 64. And lastly, this sign for a farm says Moo Moo Farm in the US, but Momo Farm in Japan, which before I get corrected for it, in Japan, it would still sound like a cow moo. That's why it's spelled the way that it is. And obviously it was changed in the US for the more common spelling that we do out here. But speaking of Moo Moo Farm, let's move on to the next subject. And the reason why we move on now to menu stuff is that there's English written words that the Japanese version has that plain as day tells you what in Japan they decided they were going to name these courses. But there are so many courses in the US version that were completely renamed, despite the fact that it's already been spelled out for them. And one of those was Moo Moo Farm. But that is probably the least interesting among some of these other changes. For example, Luigi Raceway is Luigi Circuit in Japan. Karakara means parched or dried up, so Karakara Desert is the name in Japan. And they did a really interesting change in the US. It's the Calamari Desert. It's almost like a nod to the original name, whereas at the same time not being anywhere close to an accurate translation. Canopio Highway turned into Toad's Turnpike. Canopio is the Japanese word for toad, and it's the highway change to turnpike that is especially interesting here. Mario Circuit and Peach Circuit in Japan, just like the Luigi Circuit, they were all changed to Raceway. Koopa Castle was turned into Bowser's Castle, which again makes total sense. In the US, DK's Jungle Parkway was changed from Donkey Jungle Park, a very wise decision. Hyodoro Lake was changed to Banshee Boardwalk. One of the things you'll notice here in the player select menu, the only cup that's changed in the Japanese one is the Kanoko Cup, changed into the Mushroom Cup. And for the player select screen, you're going to see that there's a couple of names that are changed based off of the cemented US localization of certain character names, like Canopio being Toad, Koopa being Bowser, and also D-Kong being changed to DK. Another good change, but also if you look at it very, very closely, you can see that the font for all the names are slightly different between the two versions. And to bring it back to the Super Nintendo version, we got a couple of things on the title screen here that were just gutted out for the US release. What looks like children's crayon drawings on the sky itself features a couple of Japanese phrases in the Japanese version. There's a little umbrella here that says Mario and Peach in Japanese. It looks like a drawing of a little umbrella here, and the names of Mario and Peach are underneath it. It's a cute little thing in Japanese culture that is supposed to signify two people under one umbrella, which is known as an ai gasa. And then over here, a whole Japanese phrase that just says Mario Kart. Again, I'm really surprised that the devs just didn't choose to translate any of this and instead removed it completely. And lastly, the Mario Kart logo right on the front of the screen was once more bunched up in the Japanese version. It's not easy to notice on your own. By doing a side-by-side comparison like we're doing here and transitioning it into one another, you can see how the letter A kind of clips into other letters in the word Mario Kart. Okay, and lastly, let's talk about Super Mario RPG. This one had a pretty wild localization. It has made a lot of differences in terms of the script that are completely different from the Japanese side of things. The first most striking and most notorious change in this game, you may have heard of it, Bowser's victory stance had to be changed for the US version. Over in the US, he kind of pumps both his fists, which honestly is a great victory pose. You get a nice look at his face. But in Japan, he does the bras d'honneur, which in Japan, it's used to convey courage or determination. But in Brazil and Italy, for example, it can be a lot more offensive. Think about the worst hand gesture you could do in America, and it's equivalent to that. Another massive overhaul was the file select screen. I guess the font for the US version just was too crowded and too large to fit into these tiny boxes that were used for the Japanese version. So in order to avoid having to compose an all new font, the file select screen was reworked, which hides a bunch of details not seen in the US version, like this dial to the left over here, as well as these exhaust stacks. And in the opening intro sequence, the game does a sort of roll call. And while Super Mario and Mallow remain the same, Princess Peach is known as Princess Toadstool, and King Bowser is known as King Koopa. Peach and Koopa are names that are still used in Japan to this day, Koopa! Whereas in later games, the US finally conformed to Princess Peach. And yes, Geno's name is also the same in the intro sequence. However, Geno's quote-unquote real name, which is unpronounceable, was a series of existing symbols used throughout the game in the US version, but in the Japanese version, there's wingding-like images that are never used anywhere else in the game. So if you want to know what Geno's real name was, it's a Pokeball, some stink lines, an eyeball, and a scroll bar cursor. And then there's a secret code that is completely exclusive to the Japanese version. And when the player puts in this secret code, Toad shows up in the menu screen and says, "Secret code discovered." All right, so let's check your stats. Wow, nothing's changed. But what about your experience points? Nope, nothing's changed. And so there's no point in looking for other secret codes, and you'll always get the same result. But I'll play with you as much as you want. The end of secret code. This was likely some sort of debugging tool that was used by the developers and left in the game as sort of an Easter egg, and then just gutted entirely for the US version. And here's one that's a little uninteresting. In the US, they have a subtitle that says Legend of the Seven Stars. But in Japan, all it has underneath there is the title of the game written in Japanese, Super Mario RPG. So this one's pretty cool. The user interface for Super Mario RPG uses the controller pad to signify which buttons do what. In the US, we have a Super Nintendo controller that is only two tones. It's a dark purple and a light purple, whereas in Japan, it's multicolored. And so in order to compensate for that, the localizers really went for the trouble of changing all the colors of the user interface here, which is really cool. They even went the extra mile for future parts of the game, where a boss named Boyer deactivates certain moves that you would normally be able to do. And how about things that are not changed between the US and the Japanese version, which has caused some confusion amongst fans over the years? When you get onto the Royal Bus, it says JB on the bus itself. Now, why is that? Well, a character that has been talked about on this show specifically, Lakitu, has a different name over in Japan. It's Jugemu. If you want a full explanation behind the name Jugemu, I recommend you watch the Super Mario Kart episode after this video. But for now, all you need to know is that its name is Jugemu, and so the JB stands for Jugemu Bus. Why the Royal Bus wasn't cleverly changed to something that starts with J, or why the graphics of the Jugemu Bus couldn't be modified slightly, I don't know. Also, another weird thing is that Booster is known as Buki over in Japan, and you can see his Japanese name written out above this welcome sign, and that Japanese lettering was never changed for the US version, which makes for another interesting lack of change. And this enemy you should already know is a Sniffit, but in Super Mario RPG for the US, they call this particular variant Spookums, which is really strange because this variant has its Japanese equivalent name Mucho, which Mucho is the official Japanese name for Sniffit. Now, when you do the Psychopath ability, which allows you to read enemies' minds, in the US, it's thinking "Que pasa?" Now, you might be wondering, why is it speaking Spanish? Well, the Japanese developers are very aware of the fact that muchos sounds like a Spanish word, whereas in the Japanese version, it says "Como esta española?" This nod to the Spanish-sounding names of the muchos extends itself into later games as well. The latest example I can think of is Paper Mario and the Origami King, where you find them in a heavily Mexican-inspired environment. Now let's talk about some other common misconceptions that people have had. Over by this fireplace, you can find something of Princess Toadstools. Now, your imagination is allowed to wander wherever direction it wants to go, but people have made this mistake of saying that in the Japanese version, it's more explicit, as you can see 3 X's instead of 3 question marks. However, this does indicate that in Japan, they're also unsure about what this means, just the same as it is in the US, and to clarify that confusion, it's localized to show the 3 question marks so that we don't jump to any insane conclusions. And over here in the US, we know Exor and everyone else as part of Smithy's gang. However, this sort of localization sort of misleads the US players as far as what the role is of Smithy and his army. If it was translated more literally from Japanese, Smithy gang would more so be like the Blacksmith King's army, or the Smith King army. And now I briefly want to go over the physical aspects of the games, because you'll find that there's a really cool thing inside of these game manuals if you didn't know already. First thing I want to talk about is the box art for the Japanese version. If you end up picking up a physical version of the remake, you might find this to look very familiar. This is because the original box art in Japan just had a white background with some of the key characters, but also Yoshi for, I'm guessing, marketing reasons. And in the remake, they essentially replicate that. Though interestingly, they put Geno in the front. I guess Geno has developed some marketing appeal over the years. Anyways, the game cartridge features just Mario, and the game manual has Luigi's only appearance in the game. I was a bit surprised by this, but Luigi does not have a 3D render, and instead uses key art from previous Mario games. I thought for sure this was just going to be a thing for the US manual only, considering the developers could easily make a render of Luigi if they wanted to, but no, it got its start here in Japan. And on the back, it has a blurb about the game, reading from right to left. It says, as usual, Princess Peach is kidnapped. As usual, Mario heads to Koopa Castle. But right before, there is something different. The first RPG in the series. The curtain of Mario's grand adventure opens. Now, with the way that it's worded, you would think that it's trying to hide the fact that Smithy is involved with this game. And you'd be right. Anyone might be able to recall that if you had no save files on your copy of Super Mario RPG, Exor, who's usually stabbed inside of Koopa Castle, is missing in both the title screen and with such dedication also in the game's intro cinematic. Now if we move over to the US side of things, they didn't do a really good job of hiding the fact that Exor is in Koopa's castle, now did they? Anybody who buys the game or even has the cartridge of the game can see Exor sitting right there, ruining the surprise. Although it should be stated that the Japanese box also kind of drops the ball here, showing Exor on the back of the box. And as you're gonna see here, the Luigi gimmick of him talking about Mario and everything else is featured in the US manual as well. And on the back of the box of the US version, it says, an incredible new adventure where mystery and mayhem rule. Mario returns in this new role-playing adventure. His latest rival is Smithy, a menacing creature who causes fear and treachery in the Mushroom Kingdom. Mario must recover the 7 stars and repair the Star Road before he can make his way to Bowser Castle for a final confrontation with Smithy. Powerful weapons, sinister spells, and other useful items help Mario complete his harrowing journey. New friends and old allies support him along the way. Even Bowser lends a hand. The back of this box is not shy at all about trying to tell you that Bowser is not the lead enemy of this game. The plot twist that is supposed to be at the very start is completely absent in all the marketing material on this box. Alright, now this is the part of the video where we get into Ted Woolsey's localization. As I go through this, just remember that localization is different from literally translating a script. And so now we're gonna look at some stuff that's just strikingly different from one another. Like this scene right here, this boy is frozen, and in the US, he says, I wanna go someplace fun. Standing around here is so boring. Whereas over on the right, he talks about peeing his pants. This snippet here says, please refrain from bothering Booster. Whereas in Japan, it says, please refrain from chasing Buki-sama's butt. And this one's really cool. This character right here has a whole arc of being obsessed with jumping, sort of in a fangirl-like way, and it can be up to you to decide whether or not Ted Woolsey did something more interesting with it. Over in the US, when you stop here, this character says, hey Mario, look what you're standing in, and then you jump, and she goes, ha, gotcha. In Japan, she says, hi Mario, show me your special jump. And then she says, oh, oh, that's so cool. And you'll see that there's a heart at the end of this dialogue to sort of represent the fangirliness. And here's where it really starts to get lost in translation. Her obsession with jumping continues in Japanese, whereas in the US, you'll see that it plays out a lot differently. In the US, she says, I don't know what that reptile is up to, but man, can he jump. Whereas in Japan, she says, what was up with that crocodile? But he's so good at jumping. And then here she says, Mario, let's see how you're going to take care of Bowser. But over in Japan, the jumping gimmick is continued, where she says, Mario, I want to see your special jump again. After you jump, she says in the US, wow, he doesn't stand a chance. Whereas in Japan, she says, wow, you're gonna beat him with that? So cool. And here's one of my favorite lines from the game, only to find out it's really different in Japan. And it'll definitely break my heart if it's not in the remake. When Krako runs by this Toad, you can talk to him, and Mallow will ask him why he didn't stop him. In the US, Toad says, because I forgot my bazooka at home. Sheesh, give me a break here, followed by a comedic fall. But the dialogue in Japanese is way more bland, where he just states, I'm just a lookout. Another famous Ted Woolsey line is the Bruce Lee moment. Yes, you heard me right, I said Bruce Lee, where Mario's about to fight the boss, and Mallow says, who do you think you are, Bruce Lee? You can't just go in there with your fist flying. In the Japanese version, he just says, whoa, wait a minute. Another movie reference here, where in the US version it says, I'm shaken but not stirred. In Japanese, he says, I'm afraid but I'll keep watch. In the Mary Moore Deluxe Suite, there's a bathrobe over on the wall. In the US, it's just very plainly stated it's too small for you. Whereas in Japan, it gets a little more specific. It says that it's mushroom-sized. And one of Luigi's 2 in-game cameos is here on Star Road. And surprisingly, the dialogue between these two are very different. They both indicate that it's Luigi, with the US version saying, I want to be a great plumber like my brother Mario. In Japanese, it might be a little harder to tell that it's Luigi, with the dialogue only translating to, I want to help my big brother. And this one's pretty amazing. So there's this password you got to put in before you meet Johnny. And you can uncover a series of hints all throughout this area to figure out that in the US version, the password is pearls. Now, how does this work in the Japanese version? Well, amazingly, the password in the original Japanese version uses the same exact amount of characters, and the correct character is in the same exact slots as the US version. And that means you can play both games side by side and get the correct password by moving Mario identically to one another in each version. However, the password is not pearls. The answer in the Japanese version is aquarium, specifically the businesses that you would go and visit. And then the battle with Culex is insanely different. I remember distinctly all the dialogue in the US version giving a real sense of mystique to this character, but in Japan, when you translate it, it becomes very clear that he's really meant to be more of a gag than anything. So let's get into it. In English, everything reads out as, greetings, I am Culex, Dark Knight of Vanda. I have crossed into this dimension to fight for the Dark Mage, but this world is uninhabitable for me and my kind. I must return to my world. Before I go, though, I would like to challenge your strongest knight. Will you accept my challenge? Will you enter combat against me? After agreeing, he says, on guard. And after you beat him, he says, ah, your spirit is strong. Thank you, brave knight. I will treasure this memento of my journey here. Perhaps in another time, another game, we may have been mortal enemies. Let us part as comrades in arms. Take this. Treasure it as a keepsake of our fight. Farewell, champion knight. And you end up getting something called the Quartz Charm, which you will see is a pretty bad translation there, because in Japanese, it becomes a lot more clear that he's a gag for being a 2D sprite instead of looking 3D, and also draws a heavy inspiration to a over-dramatized Final Fantasy villain, and even uses the 4 crystals that you typically saw in Final Fantasy games past. Anyways, the translation goes like this. O travelers who appear before me, I am Crystaller, ruler of all evil in this world. On this spot, I feel and resonate with fluctuations emitted from a dimensional rift. You living ones before me, why do you possess thickness? Why do you have such solidity? I am made of the power of evil. My form is depicted on naught but a flat surface. Yet you are formed from a power foreign to me. I wish to know the secret of the solid world. I shall fight with the utmost of my power. Now, demonstrate your might. And after defeating him in the Japanese version, he goes, "Gah! This power. Yes, now I understand. The power of the third dimension is that of power of legend. The power said to far surpass the fluctuations of evil. Love, friendship, joy. The power of hope for peace. It appears this strength is too much for me. Now I will vanish to that land." until I someday gain the power of the third dimension and the fluctuations visit yet unknown lands. O travelers who appear before me, I give you this. Farewell, O mighty ones. Goodbye. And you receive the Crystal Charm, which makes more sense since, again, Final Fantasy 1 through 5 oftentimes used crystals as a main MacGuffin for the series. And so if this is anything to go on, you can probably expect Crystaller or Culex to be pretty much unchanged in the remake, considering his whole gimmick is that he's supposed to be 2D. Here's another interesting localization change. Nimbus Land was originally known as the Marshmallow Kingdom. And oh my god, how did I never realize that mallow is just a shorthandle for marshmallow? Never even crossed my mind. But yeah, even King Nimbus is known as King Marshmallow. And a character that was also in Nimbus Land is Valentina, though in Japanese, her name is Margarita, and she holds a margarita in her hand. You can even see a clear visual of this in the render artwork that was used to promote the game. Also, Red Essence is known as Red Yoshi Extract, which I do not love the implications of that. But a massive change has to be all the dialogue for the Axum Rangers, and I mean all of it. Over on the US side of things, Axum Black says, "Hey Red, look down there. That's gotta be the ugliest mustache I've ever seen." With Pink saying, "Ew, gross." Yellow saying, "That guy's worse looking than that Claude Mario." And Green saying, "That is Mario, you idiot." Red saying, "Listen everyone, we gotta get this star back to the blade immediately." And in Japanese, they more accentuate the failing parody of being Sentai characters. We're very familiar with the Power Rangers. This sort of thing goes on all the time in Japan, and that is exactly what they're supposed to be here, a mockery of that genre. So reading out the Japanese dialogue, it says, "Hey Red, did we name ourselves properly?" Followed by Pink saying, "Oops, we forgot." With Yellow basically saying that they should go see Mario again to sort of do a do-over. Then Green says, "Oh, but he's already here." And then Red says, "Listen everyone, we're in a bit of trouble right now. Carrying the star piece right now is what takes priority. We need to bring the star to the summit." And then if you read their minds, there's this great gag that gets lost in translation. So Pink is saying something along the lines of, "Red's stance is strange." And Ranger Black says, "Red's pose is different than it's supposed to be. Is this okay?" And Red thinks to himself, "Crap, I just got my pose wrong just then." Yellow says, "Having everyone grouped up into one team is a good feeling." And Green says, "Well, I guess it's time for us to break up." And as you can see, that's all very, very different from how it was translated into the US. Anyways, moving on to Samus. Yeah, you might not know that Samus is a cameo character in this game. And she says, "I'm resting up for Mother Brain." However, in Japanese, it's very different. It's just sort of like a gag of the word Metroid. It's hard to directly translate, but there's a misspelling in the word Metroid to make it look like it's a combination of the word Metroid and amusing. And now we're gonna move on to a couple of mistranslations. This happens a lot with the moves, like these Pogo Shy Guys over here. In the US, it's called Drain, but it doesn't actually drain your health in the traditional JRPG sense, where it would take away your health to give it to the enemy. And in Japan, it doesn't even say Drain, it says Fireball. Mario's Fire Orb attack in the US is also known as Fireball in Japan. You'll find that all of Mario's clothing and special moves are much more tailored to Mario than the English localization lets on. For example, Mario wears shirts in the US version, whereas in Japan it's known as overalls. The Gobi in the US version is obviously a cheap, and in Japan it's acknowledged as such. This move that Johnny uses is called Lightsaber in Japan. I can see why they might need to change that, since it could be too close of a reference to Star Wars, and it might even be an inadvertent one. And I'll tell you something, what's really funny is that this gets mistranslated to Mega Drain. It's like the evolved version of the mistake that was made in the first correction that we talked about. Now, we all know that this enemy looks a heck of a lot like Donkey Kong. When I was a kid, I thought it was Donkey Kong until I read the enemy name, which is just Gorilla. And just in case you're curious, this fake Donkey Kong's name is Doskiyun. And when you read its mind, this is the closest hint we get that it's supposed to be a parody of Donkey Kong, with the US saying, "Don't confuse me with someone else." But the Japanese version kills it with such a great joke that would have worked really well in the US, saying, "This is a work of fiction, has no connection to any real people, living or dead." Another weird translation is the Batub ring in Marymore is the Love Love ring over in Japan, probably signifying that it's supposed to be an engagement type ring. It can only be worn by Princess Peach, so I mean, that's probably the most likely answer here. It's so strange that I got changed to Batub ring, because the description even says you'll win her heart with this, so I'm trying to figure out what exactly they were trying to go for here. Here's another cool reference that got lost in translation. This enemy here, who is clearly made of crystals, is called Pulsar in the US and Rupee in Japan. Pan, which is an obvious reference to the Zelda series. And if you're still in the mood for more cool Mario content, I've looked at Mario RPG Out of Bounds, and there was so much crazy stuff that you wouldn't imagine in a Super Nintendo game. Want to give a huge thank you to Clyde Mandolin and his website Legends of Localization. There will be a link to his live streams that was a major resource for this video. And other than that, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.